It's 1945 and World War II is over. Adolf Hitler is dead. So are his top lieutenants, Heinrich Himmler and Joseph Goebbels. But dozens of high-level Nazis are still alive and in prison. What do the Allied powers do with them? They take them to court in their own backyard. The Nuremberg trials were a series of international prosecutions that decided the fates of Nazi war criminals. Why hold these trials in the German city of Nuremberg? Well, for one, unlike a lot of German towns, Nuremberg was relatively undamaged by the war, and, just as importantly, the city had been the site of several infamous Nazi rallies. Prosecuting Nazi leaders there brought a symbolic closure to the Third Reich. The trials were administered by the four principal nations of the Allied powers: the United States, Great Britain, the Soviet Union, and France. However, each of these countries had their own laws and legal system, and had to settle on a common framework of justice. They couldn't try each defendant 4 different ways. So in August of 1945, they all sat down and hammered out the London Charter of the International Military Tribunal. With the London Charter, the Allies agreed that the defendants would stand trial and be allowed to have their own defense attorneys. Instead of a single judge, there would be a tribunal, 4 judges, 1 from each Allied country. The London Charter also defined the 3 major charges each criminal would face: crimes against peace, like planning and starting a war crimes, such as killing POWs, and crimes against humanity, in other words, killing civilians, as the Nazis did during the Holocaust. The trials lasted at Nuremberg from 1945 to 1949, but the highest profile cases were brought to court between 1945 and 1946. This period was known as the trial of the major war criminals. Among the 22 Nazi leaders on trial at Nuremberg were Gestapo founder Hermann Göring, Deputy Führer Rudolf Hess, Nazi Foreign Minister Joachim von Ribbentrop, and the German architect Albert Speer. 2 additional Nazis had been indicted, but one, Labor Chief Robert Ley, killed himself before the trials. The other, weapons manufacturer Gustav Krupp von Bohlen und Halbach, was declared mentally unfit. He was senile. Starting in November of 1945, the tribunal heard testimony and reviewed evidence for 216 court sessions. The horrors and crimes of the Nazis were put on display for all the world to see. In October of 1946, the court handed down its verdicts: 12 death sentences, including those for Göring and Ribbentrop. 3 got life in prison, 4 got lengthy jail terms, and 3 were acquitted. Nothing could undo the devastation of the war. Nothing could bring back the millions of lives lost in the Holocaust and the millions more lost in battle. But the Nuremberg trials were an important step towards rebuilding an international system of justice. They established important legal precedents for future international trials, including those for Japanese war criminals and for trials decades later in Rwanda and the former Yugoslavia. The Nuremberg trials officially entered the crimes of the Third Reich into the historical record, so that there would be no doubt about what the regime had done.
Well, hello there. Thank you for joining me today. I'd like to start with a rather famous quote. It will kind of set the tone for today's show. This is from Adolf Hitler. After all, the victor will not be asked whether he told the truth or not. Heil Hitler! Did you know that Hitler had his own salute? Yeah. Also, today we're going to be talking about Nuremberg. Lots of things about Nuremberg. Did you know they had a secret art bunker there? And also, I read across a very interesting photograph. Nazis wearing fez hats. I kid you not. Then there was another deal going on. When exactly did the USA turn on Muslims? Also, I'll be covering this. Joseph Goebbels, his stepson, they all connect as elites. So today's going to be kind of a let's connect all these people together show. Joseph Goebbels had a stepson, one of the richest people in the world. As the stepson turned out. Also, I hope to answer the questions like, well, why exactly didn't Japan get a Nuremberg-type trial after the war? Japan was pretty busy over there with that Unit 731 doing some pretty extraordinary experiments. So why exactly didn't Japan have a trial like the Germans did? And speaking of that, why not Italy? Italy did a lot of things during the war. Why was there no Nuremberg-style trial for them? Interesting questions also. I'll be covering the Marshall Plan. Many of us see the Marshall Plan as a complete myth, so we'll be covering that also. Then I got to thinking, Dorothy, the Wizard of Oz, she clicked her heels and said something about going back to Kansas or something. Well, the Nazis also clicked their heels. In the city of Nuremberg, it's full of symbolism. Just like Taylor Swift's wedding. And no, don't worry, I'm not going to be covering gossip today about celebrity weddings, but I want to just make some comparisons here. Taylor Swift recently got married, okay? And I started thinking about, Madison Square Garden. Well, it's kind of a dump of a place, right? And people are like, well, why didn't they go to a private island or a castle to get married in? Well, it's basically because they love those symbols. And Madison Square Garden is on 33rd Street. And I'll have a lot more about that. And interestingly enough, Madison Square Garden, it was first created by Barnum, the circus guy. Barnum, yeah. That was the first time Madison Square Garden entered the picture was under P.T. Barnum, the circus people. I would have to argue this is looking more and more like a circus act to me. I will also be covering Bayer aspirins. It raised its ugly head here. Roundup, the chemical, that very deadly one that came out of Germany. Well, it's about to get a big pass because in the United States right now, what they're trying to do is give Roundup, the chemical they're spraying all over the place. They're trying to make it so no one can sue them for any kind of damages. So Roundup, created by Bayer aspirin, will become a protected species. So I do want to talk about Bayer aspirin today for a bit because, Bayer aspirin started during the Nazis, during the war. They were the biggest chemical company there. They just happened to have come out of Germany, and they were involved in the Spanish flu, World War I, and World War II. And really, they seem to survive until today just fine. And also, I'll talk first here about the people that lost their power, because the royals are always involved in this stuff, right? Because they all are mixing together, right? The royals, the politicians and stuff, right? Well, let's take a look at, because in Nazi Germany, we had the Hohenzollern, the royal family. So let's take a look at, because we're talking about Germany, what happened to that royal family after the war? And where did they get all that money from in the first place? So let's take a look at that first, and then I'll just keep going down my list here. Okay, 1918, the German Empire collapses. In a matter of weeks, Kaiser Wilhelm II abdicated. 4 kings lost their thrones. 6 grand dukes, 5 dukes, 7 princes. The monarchies disappeared almost overnight in Germany. What happened to Kaiser Wilhelm II? Well, he fled to the Netherlands. He lived in exile at a place called Huis-Dorn. He was never extradited or tried. He died there in 1941. He requested not to be buried in Germany until the monarchy was restored. So his remains are still there because a restoration never occurred. So because Crown Prince Wilhelm, the son, is the controversial figure, he believed Hitler might restore the monarchy. So he publicly endorsed Hitler in 1932. He appeared with Hitler at the Day of Potsdam. He wore an SA uniform in at least one well-known photograph. It was eventually discovered that Hitler had no intention of restoring the monarchy. So then we have the other group in Bavaria. They're called the Wittelhacks. Their story was very different. That family generally opposed Hitler. So Crown Prince Ruprecht rejected Nazi overtones, and members of the family were persecuted during the war, with some ending up in concentration camps. So after World War II, the Soviet occupation confiscated many royal estates in Eastern Germany. What a shame. Palaces, land, and art collections were seized by the Russians. Families with holdings in Western Germany generally retained more property or later negotiated settlements. So, beginning in the 1990s, several former royal families sought compensation or the return of artwork, libraries, castles, and other property. Hey, give it back to us. The Hohenzollern became involved in lengthy legal disputes over whether Crown Prince Wilhelm had given substantial support to Hitler, a key legal question affecting compensation claims. And then they came up with a settlement in 2025. The Hohenzollern dispute largely ended in a negotiated settlement. Thousands of historical objects remained in public museums. A foundation was created to manage them. The family received representation on the foundation's board. They did not regain the palaces they sought. So today, the former royal families have no constitutional power, cannot rule Germany. Their titles are legally part of their surnames rather than official ranks. Some remain extremely wealthy through inherited assets, foundations, forests, castles, businesses, and investments. They continue to attract public attention because of their history and, in some cases, ongoing property claims. Different dynasties made different choices. Some sought accommodation with Hitler, believing he might restore the monarchy. Others rejected him and suffered for it. Those wartime decisions continue to influence how historians and the German public view them today. But where did they get all that money from in the first place? Well, the local ruler gains power. Originally, the ruler controls land because of conquest, inheritance, election, or feudal arrangements. Much of what we now think of as public authority and private ownership wasn't clearly separated. So then taxes begin flowing to the ruler. So they basically pick out an area, maybe have a battle or something, and then they gain power over that area, right? Originally, the ruler controls land because of conquest, inheritance, election, or feudal arrangements. So that once they take all this over, taxes begin flowing to the ruler. People pay taxes, rents, fees, labor obligations, military service, and other dues. And if you'll notice that today the same thing happens. All the money always seems to always flow to the top. Even in cases like things like Uber, right? The drivers eventually get squeezed out, and all that money seems to somehow end up in the hands of the people running things, right? So the people pay the taxes, but some of that money funds roads, castles, armies, courts, and government. Some also support the ruler's households and lifestyle. And these dynasties can last for generations. After 100 or 200 years, it becomes difficult to answer questions like, does this palace belong to the king personally or to the crown? Who owns the royal art collection? Is this forest state land or family land? Did taxpayers build it or did the dynasty purchase it? Those questions often had no clear answer because governments and monarchs were effectively intertwined. That's exactly why, after Germany's monarchy ended in 1918, there were decades of legal disputes over what belonged to the Hohenzollerns personally and what belonged to the Prussian or German state. Those negotiations and notes that this distinction remained legally contentious well into the modern era. So yes, these fights will go on for a very long time because somehow they end up in these territories, they end up getting all that land, and then they want to claim that it's all theirs, right? So over centuries, dynastic wealth accumulated through taxation, land grants, inheritance, marriage alliances, feudal rights, monopolies, and state revenues, often with very little distinction between the ruler as a person and the ruler as a state. When monarchies disappeared, democracies inherited a legal puzzle that often took decades or more than a century to resolve. So that's what happened to the people from Germany, the royal family there. Well, they fought up until this last year to get their stuff back, right? And I don't know. To me, it looks like they got their stuff from the people in Germany and they just want to hang on to it, right? But hey, you'll have to decide for yourself. So let's get to the topic of the Nurembergs. There's actually two Nurembergs. In 1935, the Nazi regime selected Nuremberg as the site of its annual Reich Party Congress because of the city's symbolic association with the medieval Holy Roman Empire and its role as the centerpiece of Nazi mass rallies. On September the 15th, 1935, the regime proclaimed the Reich Citizen Law and the Law for the Protection of German Blood and German Honor, measures that became collectively known as the Nuremberg Laws. 1945. After the Second World War, the Allies chose Nuremberg as a location for the International Military Tribunal for both practical and symbolic reasons. The city's Palace of Justice was one of the few large courthouse complexes to survive the war largely intact and included an attached prison. Well, that's handy. Holding the trial of the major war criminals before the International Military Tribunal in the same city where the Nazi regime had staged its Great Party rallies and proclaimed the Nuremberg Laws served as a powerful repudiation of Nazi rule. So let's talk a little bit about, so we have those two things going on in Nuremberg, and I believe it's because of those symbols, right? Let's talk a little bit about this fez hat. I was pretty shocked. I was looking at some pictures, and I saw a couple Nazi guys wearing a fez hat. Well, who were the Nazi guys? Well, they were from the 13th Waffen Mountain Division of the SS, a formation composed mainly of Bosnian Muslims under German officers. The fez hat was not just decorative. It was official SS headgear for the division. There were two versions, a field gray fez for duty and combat, and a red fez for parade and off-duty wear. Both hats carried SS insignia, including the eagle and that skull. The design drew on the earlier Austro-Hungarian Bosnia regiments, which had also worn the fez hat. So, by the end of the war, the SS was no longer an exclusively German or even exclusively Nordic force. By April 1945, the Waffen SS had nearly 830,000 personnel, with only about 40% being German nationals. It included ethnic Germans from outside Germany and recruits or conscripts from numerous European nationalities. The SS began as Hitler's small personal guard, not as the enormous organization it later became. It gradually absorbed policing, intelligence, concentration camp administration, racial policy, settlement programs, economic enterprises, and an armed military branch. The SS was a state within the state. It did not merely consist of soldiers. It controlled the Gestapo, the Secret Service, criminal and uniformed police structures, concentration camps, intelligence files, slave labor enterprises, and racial offices. So the Waffen SS was called a clean combat soldier. After the war, veterans often claimed that battlefield units were separate from camp systems and mass murder. In reality, personnel and units crossed between frontline and rear area duties, and Waffen SS formations participated in atrocities and anti-partisan operations. Its racial rules collapsed when manpower was needed. Early recruitment demanded supposedly Nordic ancestry, physical measurements, and genealogical proof. Later military necessity produced French, Scandinavian, Latvian, Croatian, Bosnia Muslims, and other formations. Nazi racial doctrine was repeatedly adjusted whenever the regime needed soldiers. So anyway, I'm buzzing along looking at the Waffen SS, and I'm thinking, why are these Nazis wearing a fez hat? Now remember, I'm kind of a hat expert. When I first realized the Pope and the Jews wore the same hat, the Jews wear that yarmulke, which is a nod to Saturn, and the Catholics also they call it the zucchetto. And so, the Jews wear the yarmulke, the Catholics wear it, they call it the zucchetto. So, basically, they wear the same hat, that little round skull cap. And yet, that all comes from Saturn. So, what they say about the fez hat, therefore captures that contradiction perfectly. An organization built around claims of Germanic racial purity ended the war, placing SS skulls and eagles on the traditional headgear of Bosnian Muslim recruits. So no one knows where the fez hat came from, and I've talked about this endlessly because I've been a big fan of the fez hat for a very long time now. It first was noticed in the city of Fez in Morocco, and that's where it got its name from. 1400s to 1700s, similar brimless, it's called when it's not a fez hat can also be a brimless hat, right? There's no brim around the thing. So they were common in Morocco, Algeria, Tunisia, Egypt, of course, the Balkans, and parts of the Ottoman Empire. At this stage, it was simply regional headwear. In 1826, it was a turning point. Kind of funny timing, huh? Sultan Muhammad II abolished this other hat and modernized the Ottoman military. He ordered the fez to replace turbans as standard military and civil service dress. So that they just changed to the fez hat. And the 1830s and 70s, the fez hat spread across the Ottoman Empire. It was worn by soldiers, police, judges, bureaucrats, postal workers, government officials, and merchants. For many people, wearing a fez hat meant loyalty to the Ottoman state. Late 1800s, European colonial officers and travelers frequently encountered the fez hat throughout Turkey, Egypt, Bosnia, Syria, Lebanon, Palestine, Libya, and Tunisia. It became one of the visual symbols of the Ottoman world. So how does Bosnia get in the picture? Well, 1878 to 1918, Bosnia came under Austro-Hungarian rule. The Austrians kept Bosnian Muslim regiments wearing fez hats because they respected local religious traditions. And those Bosnian regiments became famous throughout Europe. And that explains the Waffen SS connection decades later. During World War I, 1914 to 1918, fez hats were still worn by Ottoman army units, Bosnian Muslim regiments, and many civilians throughout the Middle East. In 1925, the fez hat was banned in Turkey under the hat law because they saw it as a symbol of the old Ottoman Empire and wanted Western hats instead. The ban dramatically reduced everyday use in Turkey. So then in 1930s to 1945, the Nazis recruited Bosnian Muslims into the 13th Waffen Mountain Division, or the SS. Those soldiers wore the traditional fez with the SS insignia. It looked strange because the SS is usually associated with black peach caps. Historically, however, Hitler was willing to preserve traditional dress when recruiting foreign units, or the foreign units all connect to the rest of them, right? And then in the 1870s to the present, we have that group called the Shriners. The Shriners International adopted the fez hat in the late 19th century. The organization, don't worry, I have a point here. I know I like weird details, but I have a pretty specific point coming up here, so just hang in there. So the Shriners International adopted the fez hat, okay? The organization borrowed Middle Eastern imagery because its rituals and symbolism were inspired by romanticized ideas of Arabia, North Africa, and the Ottoman world. Not because it had any historical connection to those governments, or so they say. So the fez hat became the most recognizable symbol, and it usually bears that crescent, that satanic crescent, the Sphinx, and the chapter name of the group. Today, the fez hat is still worn by the Shriners during some ceremonial military occasions in the Balkans, in parts of Morocco, during cultural festivals throughout northern Africa, by a few traditional religious groups. So, who has worn the fez hat? Well, Ottoman sultans, Ottoman army officers and soldiers, Ottoman police, Ottoman judges, civil servants, Bosnian Muslim regiments under Austria-Hungary, Ottoman officials throughout the Middle East, 13th Waffen SS Division, they wore the fez hat, the Shriners, various North African civilians, and some religious orders. So, the fez hat represented very different things depending on the era. In Morocco, it reflected regional tradition. In the Ottoman Empire, it symbolized modernization and state service. In Austria-Hungary, it identified Bosnian Muslim regiments. In the Waffen SS, it marked a foreign volunteer formation. Among the Shriners, it became a ceremonial emblem inspired by an imagined Oriental aesthetic. So, the fez hat, I believe the top hat is a revised edition of the fez hat. So who wears the top hat? Well, bankers, industrialists, politicians, diplomats, wealthy businessmen, Freemasons in some ceremonial settings, Victorian and Edwardian upper class. So, one irony is that the Nazis persecuted the Roma under racial laws while simultaneously recruiting Bosnia Muslim SS troops who wore the fez hat. So during World War II, you could have Roma civilians in the Balkans wearing fez hats as traditional local dress. Or you could have the Bosnian Muslim SS wearing the fez hats with the SS insignia. So yeah, the fez hat is pretty much into there, right? So what was the Shriners do? Well, the Shriners are an Islam-inspired Masonic cult that influenced the U.S. for years. As the story goes, this man named Fleming, I'm just going to give you the very short version here. Fleming took the ideas supplied by somebody and converted them into what became, and listen to these words, the ancient Arabic order of the nobles of the mystic shrine. So, today, many Americans associate Islam primarily with the Middle East or with terrorism because of the events of the last few decades. That was not always the dominant public perception. 1700s to 1800s, most Americans had very little direct contact with Muslims. Islam was largely known throughout the Ottoman Empire, North African Barbary states, biblical history, and travel literature. The biggest early American interaction came during the Barbary States conflicts from 1801 to 1805 and 1815, when the young United States fought piracy in the Mediterranean. In the late 1800s, America developed a fascination with what people called the Orient. So during that era, you saw Shriners wearing fez hats. There were Arabian night themes, Turkish smoking rooms, belly dancing at world fairs, Moorish architecture, Ottoman-inspired decorations. Muslim imagery was often viewed as exotic or romantic rather than threatening. 1870s to 1920s, many American fraternal organizations adopted Middle Eastern imagery, and that included the Shriners International, the Moorish Revival architecture, crescent symbols, fez hats, Arabic-inspired names, and camel imagery. Those groups were supposedly not Islamic organizations. They borrowed symbols because Americans found the Ottoman and Arab worlds mysterious and fashionable, or because the people from those worlds were in fact here running this country. I mean, that's always another option, right? I discovered through all of this that my father who was born in Kansas, who served as a U.S. Air Force navigator, my father's side of the family was likely Muslim. A lot of this stuff got buried, okay? My father looks exactly like Muslim people in the Middle East. I, as a child, look exactly like a Muslim child. I even have that red hair. I have the hazel eyes. Yeah, lots of Muslims here in this country already. So anyway, the Middle East in the 20s to the 45 was not a major attention on Americans. The attention was more on Europe, Japan, the Great Depression, and World War II. 1948 to 1970s, several events gradually increased attention to the Middle East. Well, the creation of Israel was one, the Arab-Israeli wars, oil discoveries, OPEC, the 1973 oil embargo. So, 1979, a major turning point. The Iranian Revolution and the U.S. Embassy hostage crisis dominated television for over a year. For many Americans, this was their first sustained exposure to modern political Islam. 1980s, additional events reinforced that shift. Lebanon, Beirut barracks bombings, airline hijackings, Libya, Palestinian terrorism. Gee, I wonder who was behind all that. Wonder that. Just keep wondering, right? 1990s, the perception hardened further. Events including the 1993 World Trade Center bombings, East Africa embassy bombings, USS Cole attack. September 11th, 2001, this was by far the largest turning point. After the attacks, Islam became strongly associated in the American public mind with terrorism, security, Afghanistan, Iraq, and the broader war on terror. So, but why were there so many Islamic-looking symbols in America already? Well, they claim because many of them arrived before Islam was widely viewed through a security lens. Yeah, when we stopped trusting those people, right? Those nasty Muslims are coming to kill the rest of us. Well, really, when all in all, it was the U.S. government doing all these things, but the Muslims were the people they were blamed. Now, remember, this is just my view, right? I think all of this stuff was pulled off by the CIA or whoever was pulling the tricks, and the Muslims got the blame, right? And they have a little bit darker skin, so that kind of pulled them into the thing, right? Because we had the Shriners adopted the fez hat in 1872. Moorish revival buildings were fashionable. Arabian night stories were enormously popular. None of these were seen as controversial. So the same fez hat that looked perfectly ordinary on a Shriner in 1920s might today surprise people who associate it primarily with the Ottoman Empire or Islam. In many ways, the symbolism stayed the same, but its cultural meaning changed because the public's perception of Islam changed over the 20th century, especially after 1979 and even more after 2001. So yeah, say what you want, but I don't know. Clearly, it looks very clear to me that the Muslims were here before all the rest of madness took over, right? It could be this. There's allegations that the original founders and stuff weren't exactly all white, right? So maybe the Muslims were the scapegoat, right? Because these people could have been the Muslims themselves, right? So they always have to have an enemy. So maybe once they got the white thing established, they could say, hey, look, it's the Muslims. And then they had to explain why they had all this Arabian stuff all over this country and those fez hats and stuff, right? So I don't know. Always got to have an explanation, right? So this is kind of the complicated one, and I'm going to try to read very slowly because, as you can probably hear, I'm having a little bit of a neurological issue because, well, my teeth are falling out from the sulfur. My face burns like fire when I talk, and I'm having some neurological issues. So just bear with me. I'll go very slowly to try to read this. I found an excellent article called The Marshall Plan Myth. The 50th anniversary of the Marshall Plan provided another occasion for the media to celebrate the government's good works. The U.S.'s headlong plunge into global welfarism, almost $100 billion in current dollars, they said, saved European economies after the Second World War. One reporter, Garrick Utley of NBC, even theorized that Marshall aid explains why East Germany was poor and the West Germans became rich. As economist Tyler Cohen has noted, the countries that received the most Marshall Plan money, the Allies, Britain, Sweden, and Greece, grew the slowest between 1947 and 1955, while those that received the least money, Axis powers like Germany, Austria, and Italy, grew the most. In terms of post-war prosperity, then it eventually paid to be a political enemy of the U.S. instead of a beneficiary of international charity. But this truth is only news if you think that the Marshall Plan was genuinely intended to help foreign countries. But as with all government programs, it pays returns to look beneath the surface. So what exactly was the point of the Marshall Plan, named after George Marshall? It's been well described in the works of historians William Appleman Williams and these other ones. Marshall himself played the role of a patsy, delivering prepackaged speeches written by the players beneath the plan. His original pitch, given at Harvard, was for money to end hunger, poverty, desperation, and chaos. But the real upshot of the Marshall Plan was a political maneuver to loot American taxpayers to keep influential American corporations on the government dole. The plan's legacy was the egregious and perpetual use of foreign aid for domestic, political, and economic purposes. After the war ended, Harry Truman's popularity in the polls began to plummet, as did the prestige of government generally. The American people had made huge sacrifices to fight the war and now wanted curbs in government, which had been administering a centrally planned economy. Most of all, they wanted the foreign policy recommended by George Washington and Thomas Jefferson: trade with all, entanglements with none. In the mainstream of thinking was Republican Senator Robert Taft, a hero of the free market activists at the time. He demanded tax cuts, spending cuts, and an end to the constantly increasing interference with family life and with business by autocratic government bureaus and autocratic labor leaders. The Republican Party swept midterm elections in 1946, taking back the Congress on a hardcore anti-big government platform. Truman had to do something big, and he knew it. As Charles Meade reports, he needed some large program that would let him recapture the initiative, something big enough to enable him to gather in all the traditional factions of the Democratic Party and also some middle-of-the-road Republicans, and at the same time, something that would hamper the Republican phalanx and establish him as a world leader. The issue was right before him: foreign aid, funneled through the corporate establishment and cloaked in the rhetoric of opposition to foreign but not domestic communism. Cynically, he would make good use of Russia, which only the day before had been our gallant ally in the war, and transform it into a monster that had to be destroyed. By stealing the Republic's anti-socialist rhetoric, Truman hoped to frazzle his opponents and make himself a hero on the world stage. Truman had plenty of co-conspirators, men who had gone down in history as the architects of the original New World Order. Fabled establishmentarians like Averell Harriman and Charles Kinderberger were central figures. But it was Dean Acheson, Acheson, Undersecretary of State and the most menacing statist of the immediate post-war era, who concocted the plan to make the wartime empire permanent. Acheson persuaded Navy Secretary James Forrestal and domestic fixer Clark Clifford to show Truman how he could elevate a political scam like foreign aid into a mighty ideological struggle on the world stage, on the global stage. A little-known business group founded in 1942 and called the Committee for Economic Development was elevated into a think tank for a new international order, the economic counterpart to the Council on Foreign Relations. The committee's founders were the heads of the top steel, automotive, and electric industries who had benefited from the New Deal's corporatist statism. Its membership overlapped with the far-left National Planning Association, which was unabashedly a National Socialist in ideological orientation. These groups understood that they owed their profit margins to government subsidies provided by the New Deal and wartime production subsidies. Faced with post-war peace, they feared a future in which they would be forced to compete on a free market basis. Their personal and institutional security was at stake, so they got busy dreaming up strategies to sustain a profitable statism in a peacetime economy. Corporate economic interests then overlapped with Truman's political interests, and an unholy alliance between business and government was born. They would use Europe's miseries to line their own pockets in the name of rebuilding and providing security against trumped-up threats to American security. The test case came in 1947 with aid to Greece, where a communist party was making electoral advances. Truman saw the main chance and demanded $400 million in foreign aid, which Congress approved as a swipe against Russia. Just as the money was being channeled to special interest groups, however, members of Congress learned that the Russia connection to the Greek Communist Party had been phonied up. As it turned out, Greece, like every European country, just wanted the cash. Even so, the political success of the Truman Doctrine of global giveaways had been demonstrated, and the script for billions in future giveaways had been written. Over the next 5 years, Marshall money would corrupt nearly every Christian Democratic Party in Europe, turning them into carbon copies of the U.S. Democratic Party. Those political parties, in turn, worked to create monstrous welfare states and regulatory controls that continue to hinder European economic growth today. On the heels of the success in Greece, Dean Acheson formed an ad hoc committee to find situations elsewhere in the world that may require technical and military aid on our part. With no effort, the ad hoc committee was able to classify most of Europe as in need of economic aid. The committee found shortages of just about everything, and in particular, dollars to buy goods from corporate America. A mythical dollar shortage, as if trade is only possible with a world awash in paper, was the crisis at the moment. But beneath the surface, the true objective was the internationalization of the New Deal, a bureaucrat's dream. As Julius King, Secretary of the Interior, said in his memoirs, The Marshall Plan, essential to our own continued productivity and prosperity. It is as if we were building a Tennessee Valley Authority every Tuesday. Yet even after the Greece vote, polls showed tremendous public opposition to any foreign giveaways. In one meeting, the Republican House Majority Leader Charles Halleck told Truman flat out, "You must realize there is a growing resistance to these programs. I have been out hustling and I know the people don't like it." The Truman gang had already thought of that. Months before the vote, he brought together the heads of major corporations to enlist them in the cause. Members of this organizing committee, drawn from the Committee for Economic Development, included most prominently Highland Van Cheller, president of the Allegory Leadham Steel Corporation, Burgess, vice chairman of City National Bank of New York, Paul Hoffman, president of Studebaker Corporation, and later administrator of the Marshall Funds, as well as the secretary-treasurers of the AFL and the CIO. Leading the corporate charge for secure profits was Will Clayton, the Texas cotton impresario whose business was about to experience a remarkable tax subsidy boom. The last World War had already made his company the second largest cotton trading company in the world. Unlike his competitors during the New Deal, while working with FDR to wreck the American economy, he was smart enough to move his operations to Brazil, Mexico, Paraguay, and Egypt. By the Second World War, he was selling 15% of the world's cotton crops. At the war's end, he re-enlisted in the campaign for the home front. As Undersecretary of State for Economic Affairs in 1947, Clayton, too, saw the main chance. "Let us admit right off," he said, in defense of the idea of foreign aid, "we need markets, big markets, in which to buy and sell." Here is the core truth of all such aid. The intent is not to help foreign countries. It is to reward home-based multinationals who actually get the cash as the government purchased political influence abroad. Nothing was left to chance. Atkinson worked with the established corporate elites and the State Department to create a supposed grassroots organization called the Citizens Committee for the Marshall Plan. As many as 1,000 speakers representing the group toured the country to whip up support. It also ghost wrote congressional testimony from other organizations on behalf of the aid package. As Averell Harriman told several European ambassadors during a visit to the British Embassy, they haven't seen anything compared with the flood of organized propaganda which the administration is about to unleash. It was left to Will Clayton to make the economic case. Perversely, he touted the Marshall Plan as a triumph of free enterprise. Moreover, he said, if communism comes to Europe, I think the situation which we would face in this country would be a very grave one. We would have to reorder and readjust our whole economy in this country if we lost the European market. In the days before the vote, the claims became more extreme, and the media, corporate, banking, government elite on board. The propaganda became even more hysterical. We were told that a depression would come. The U.S. would be bombed. We'd be in another war if the aid package failed. The situation is as bleak as it was for France in 1938. American life as we know it would end forthwith. When the plan passed, as it easily did, the ink was hardly dry on the legislature when the ships full of goods hit the high seas. At any given moment over the next few months, 150 boats were carrying wheat, flour, cotton, tires, borax, drilling equipment, tractors, tobacco, aircraft parts, and anything else big domestic manufacturers could get their hands on. As with most goods shipped under the Marshall Plan, American producers had the advantage. 50% had to be sent on American vessels. Oil exports to Europe exploded, even as imports from Europe were cut by 1/3. In aid distribution, there was a bias in favor of finished goods to prevent European businesses from competing with American producers on down-the-line production. Taking a leaf from the Roosevelt playbook, Truman bypassed the usual bureaucracy and established a new bureau, the Economic Cooperative Administration, to distribute the aid. It, too, was staffed by the heads of major industrial corporate interests who stood to benefit at public expense. Paul Hoffman headed the group and passed out billions to well-heeled corporate powers. As historian Anthony Carew summarizes, the Marshall Plan was in all major respects a business organization run by businessmen. Most of all, the aid was used for purchases at distorted prices by American tax dollars in the hands of European governments. The mad scramble for tax dollars was a disgrace to behold, creating a low point in U.S. business history. Time and again, Congress intervened to grant corporate America what it really wanted, restrictions that forced Marshall aid to go to purchases of American oil, aluminum, wood textiles, and machines. The aid was also used to directly subsidize particular firms in recipient countries, whether or not there were viable markets for their products. Instead, the firms received money because their continued existence would artificially support full employment policies. And since American labor unions were intimately involved in choosing who got the money, the lion's share went to companies with closed union shops, paradoxically restricting the ability of labor markets to readjust to new economic realities. From an economic perspective, the Marshall Plan was modeled on a static view of investment. Countries were asked what their present needs were, and the U.S. responded. Not a thought was given to the possibility that economic growth alone would provide. It eventually did, but only after the Marshall Plan welfare was cut off and domestic manufacturers were able to find markets for their products. The result was the largest peacetime transfer of wealth from the taxpayers to corporations until that point in U.S. history. And it wasn't only dollars that were exported. Through a massive and tax-funded technical expertise program, European businesses came to the U.S. to take lessons in management practices, visiting mostly unionized automobile companies, electrical utility plants, and huge farmer operations, the most socialistic of U.S. sectors. All told, the Marshall Plan dumped $13 billion, or nearly $100 billion in today's dollars. It was enough to firmly entrench American companies in European markets, especially in Britain, France, and Germany. American-controlled companies dominated industries such as shoes, milk, cereals, machines, cars, canned goods, petroleum refinement, locks and keys, printing, tires, soaps, clocks, farm machinery, and much more. These were mere bubbles of prosperity, forced investment created through insider deals of the worst sort. Indeed, Hoffman worked under the constant fear that the racketeering would come to the surface. He feared some enterprising journalist might expose the entire thing. Hearings would follow, and the plan would be discredited. Well, that never happened. A year after the Marshall Plan began sucking private capital out of the economy, the U.S. fell into recession, precisely the opposite of what its proponents predicted. Meanwhile, the aid did not help Europe. What reconstructed Europe was the post-Marshall freeing up of controlled prices, keeping inflation in check and curbing union power. That is the free market. And even Hoffman admitted in his memoir, the aid did not in fact help the economies of Europe. The primary benefit was psychological. Expensive therapy indeed. The actual legacy of the Marshall Plan was a vast expansion of government at home, the beginnings of the Cold War rhetoric that would sustain the welfare warfare state for 40 years, a permanent global troop presence, and an entire business class on the take from Washington. It also created a belief on the part of the ruling elite in D.C. that it could trick the public into backing anything, including the idea that government and its connected interests should run the world at taxpayer expense. With the start of the Cold War, the United States identified the Soviet Union as its new enemy and accepted that without a German economic recovery, there would be no prosperity in Europe, and thus it would be only a matter of time until Western Europe, too, would fall under the dominance of the Soviet Union. Yeah, funny how they just quickly, we got to have a Cold War now. We hate the Russians, right? Well, they don't hate anybody but us, right? They all are working together. So I really need to take a break, and I will be back on the other side with much, much more. This Marshall Plan is very interesting to me because it really set all this funding of foreign countries into place, right? So then from then on, people in the United States got this idea that, yeah, we're the United States, a big white country, right? And we always support people. I had a couple people go after me online over comments that I made. Well, just not those comments, but yeah, I said something about the U.S. and how they, stole money and all that kind of stuff. And somebody shot back and they said, are you saying that the U.S. isn't generous? We are a very generous country. We give to other countries. That's how people here perceive themselves, right? We always dish out money to other countries. Well, now kind of makes it interesting why we're dishing out the money, right? Because we want to control them and they want to set up those U.S. bases all over the place, right? So this was just another trick in the bag. So I'm going to put this on hold. I'll be back on the other side. Okay, in this segment, I'm going to be talking about Japan. Why did Japan escape a Nuremberg type trial? Well, pretty interesting story here because, Japan was on the Nazi side, so how they escaped this Nuremberg thing is kind of a mystery, right? Well, let's clear up that mystery. So, Japan did not escape prosecution entirely, but it did avoid a process equivalent to what Germany experienced at Nuremberg. The United States played the dominant role in shaping that outcome. Gee, shocking information, right? So the U.S. was involved in why Japan did not get any kind of prosecution. Well, here are the supposed reasons. The United States wanted a stable, pro-Western Japan. Or were they there to protect the royals who they aligned with more closely, right? As relations with the Soviet Union deteriorated almost immediately after World War II, it's just amazing how that happened, right? One day they loved Russia. Next day, get out of here, Russia. American policy shifted from punishing Japan to rebuilding it as an ally in Asia. That was similar to how West Germany rapidly became a Cold War partner. The imperial family was protected. General Douglas MacArthur and his staff concluded that retaining Emperor Hirohito would make the occupation easier and reduce the risk of unrest. As a result, Hirohito was never indicted at the International Military Tribunal for the Far East. Evidence was shaped around that policy. Many historians conclude that prosecutors deliberately avoided building cases that would directly implicate the emperor. Responsibility was concentrated on political and military leaders, such as this guy named Hideki Tojo and other senior officials. And that Unit 731 that I've talked about in the past, where they were doing just horrible things, they were cutting people's arms off and reattaching their legs and doing, just the stuff they were doing there is just insane, right? Unit 731 received immunity. One of the clearest examples of U.S. protection involved Unit 731. Rather than prosecuting many of its leaders for human experimentation, U.S. authorities negotiated access to their biological warfare research in exchange for immunity from persecution. Hey, you get off the hook, Japan. Just give us all your nasty, nasty tricks because we, the Americans, want to do these same tricks on our own citizens. Yeah, that's exactly how it's working out, but I'll stick to the script here. Many suspects were never tried. Another shocking thing, right? The Tokyo Tribunal prosecuted 28 Class A defendants with 7 executions. Thousands of lower-level war crime trials were also held across Asia by allied nations, but many senior figures were never prosecuted or were later released. Kind of like going on now, right? You go out and commit a crime and just keep track of how long it takes to get you in prison, right? And compare that to one of the elites committing the same crime. Well, they'll never serve prison time, but you sure will, right? Some things just never seem to change. So if you're sitting around thinking, yeah, this is all going to blow over, I don't think so. But let me keep reading here. The Cold War changed priorities. This is a gift that keeps on giving, right? By 1947 to 1948, containing communism had become more important to Washington than continuing the broad war crimes prosecutions. Former officials and industrial leaders who might earlier have faced prosecution instead became useful in rebuilding Japan's government and economy. So, a major reason that Japan avoided a Nuremberg-style reckoning was that the United States deliberately limited the number of prosecutions to protect institutions and individuals it believed were important for occupying and rebuilding Japan. That included preserving the emperor, granting immunity to many Unit 731 personnel in exchange for research, and shifting toward reconciliation as the Cold War began. That does not mean that no Japanese leaders were prosecuted. The Tokyo trials resulted in convictions and executions, and thousands of additional war crimes were held throughout Asia. The debate among historians is not whether trials occurred, but whether the U.S. selectively shielded certain individuals and institutions for strategic reasons. I'm not really an expert on brutal treatment, right? And I'm not an expert on Japan, but what went on in Japan is pretty brutal, right? And brutal is almost an understatement. Unit 731 and related Japanese military units were not conducting ordinary medical research with unethical shortcuts. They were deliberately injuring, infecting, freezing, poisoning, and killing prisoners to develop biological and chemical weapons. Documented experiments included infecting people with plague, cholera, typhus, anthrax, and other diseases, vivisections, often without anesthesia, deliberate frostbite to study tissue deconstruction, weapon testing using grenades, flamethrowers and bombs, and experiments using blood loss, pressure, dehydration, and exposure. Prisoners included Chinese civilians and soldiers, Koreans, Russians, and others held by the Japanese military. What makes the story particularly disturbing is what happened afterwards. American investigators decided the information might have military value against the Soviet Union. So instead of fully prosecuting the principal researchers, U.S. authorities helped conceal the experiments and secured immunity for important participants in exchange for their records and cooperation. Give the United States the biological warfare research and the leading experimenters would not be prosecuted. So give us all your evil stuff. You gotta kind of wonder, right? Somebody says, hey, you really came up with some really, really crazy evil stuff. But hey, we're going to let you off the hook if you just share it with us. I mean, how crazy is that, right? This is one of the clearest documented cases in which the American government protected alleged war criminals because it wanted the results of their experiments. The victims received neither a public trial compared to the Nazi doctors' trial, nor full international recognition at the time. So then I had to wonder about, well, all these Nazis came over here. How many of the Japanese came over here, right? Some Japanese wartime scientists and officers did work directly with Americans after the war, but there was no Japanese equivalent of Operation Paperclip that relocated a large organized group of permanent U.S. careers. The main difference was location. With the Germans, the U.S. physically brought more than 1,500 scientists, engineers, and technicians to America through Operation Paperclip. And really, who knows how many came through just on their own, right? Or through some other group that no one's ever heard of, right? With Unit 731, the Americans largely went to Japan, interrogated the researchers there, collected their reports and specimens, and protected key figures from prosecution. Most of those men remained in Japan rather than being resettled in the U.S. U.S. investigators from the biological warfare establishment, including personnel connected to Camp Detrick in Maryland, repeatedly interviewed Unit 731 personnel and transmitted their findings back to America. Shiro Ishii, the commander of Unit 731, was not permanently brought to America. He remained in Japan after receiving immunity. There are claims that he lectured or advised Americans connected with biological warfare, but the better documented core of this story that American officers questioned him and obtained his information while shielding him from trial. Many Unit 731 doctors then entered respectable post-war careers inside Japan. They became university professors, hospital directors, medical researchers, pharmaceutical executives, and government health officials. This guy named Kitano, who was Ishii's successor at Unit 731, later became associated with the Green Cross, a major Japanese pharmaceutical company. Others returned to medical schools and research institutions with little public acknowledgement of their wartime work. So, yeah, the Japanese didn't really, I think it was closer to the keep the crime secret, question the men in Japan, obtain exclusive access to their research, block persecution, and allow many of them to rebuild influential careers in post-war Japan. That may actually have been politically easier than a Japanese paperclip. The United States controlled the occupation, had access to the scientists in their own country, and wanted Japan rapidly reconstructed as an anti-communist ally. It did not need to move most of them across the Pacific to benefit from their knowledge. There were certainly Japanese officials, researchers, and civilians who later traveled to or worked in the United States, but the available record does not show a large formal relocation program for Unit 731 personnel. The most important American action was immunity and concealment, not mass immigration. The public did not learn the full severity immediately after the war. The truth emerged in stages over several decades. 1945 to 1948, the United States learned privately. American occupation investigators interrogated Ishizushi and the other 731 personnel and received reports describing human experimentation. Instead of presenting that evidence publicly at the Tokyo war crimes trial, U.S. authorities kept the arrangement secret and pursued immunity in exchange for the research. 1946, a hint appeared at the Tokyo trial. A Chinese prosecutor raised an allegation that Japanese forces had experimented on civilians with poisonous substances, but it was treated as vague and was not pursued. Unit 731 therefore never received the public courtroom exposure that Nazi medical experiments received at Nuremberg. December 1949, the Soviets publicly exposed much of it. At the Kabiskat war crimes trial, the Soviet Union prosecuted 12 Japanese military personnel connected to biological warfare. Testimony described deliberate infections, vivisections, and biological weapon attacks. The trial record contained substantially accurate evidence, but the U.S. and much of the Western press dismissed it as communist propaganda during the early Cold War. So the information was technically public by 1949, but much of the Western public did not accept or seriously investigate it. 1950s to the 1970s, pieces surfaced, but the story remained obscure. Former personnel occasionally discussed or published medical work derived from wartime experiments, and Chinese and Soviet accounts continued to circulate. However, there was no major American or Japanese official investigation explaining the scale of the crimes or the immunity arrangement. 1981. Did you hear me correctly? We're right now in 2026. So 1981, the story broke into Japanese public consciousness. Japanese author Morimura published The Devil's Gluttony, a widely read investigation based on interviews with former participants and other evidence. The book described prisoners being infected, dissected, and killed, and helped turn Unit 731 from a largely suppressed subject into a national controversy. 1982, Japan acknowledged that Unit 731 existed. The Japanese government finally admitted the unit's existence, but it still claimed there was insufficient evidence to confirm human experimentation. 1980s to 1990s, former members, historians, and journalists added detail. Japanese scholars located American occupation records, translated thousands of pages of U.S. documents, and interviewed former Unit 731 personnel. Testimony from participants increasingly confirmed the descriptions of deliberate infection, frostbite experiments, vivisections, and weapon testing. By 1984, historian Tsunoshige published extensive U.S. documentation that made continued denial much harder. 1990s to 2000s, American records confirmed the cover-up. Declassified U.S. documents showed that American officials knew about the human experiments, considered the information potentially valuable, and protected the principal researchers from prosecution. Federal disclosure programs eventually released or identified roughly 100,000 pages relating broadly to Japanese war crimes, although important gaps remained. 2002, a Japanese court formally recognized biological warfare. The Tokyo District Court concluded that the Japanese army had conducted biological warfare attacks in China. That ruling did not provide compensation, but it was an important official judicial involvement. So the short answer is this: the Soviets revealed the essential story in 1949, but the West dismissed it. The wider Japanese and Western public did not begin to understand the full severity until investigative books, participant testimony, and American documents emerged during the 1980s and 1990s. The documentary confirmation of the U.S. immunity arrangement became much clearer through later declassifications. It certainly became a powerful policy justification for many decisions after World War II. By 1947 to 1948, the United States was confronting what policymakers viewed as a new strategic threat: Soviet expansion across Eastern Europe, the Berlin blockade, the Chinese Civil War, and later the Korean War. In that environment, priorities shifted from punishing every possible wartime offender to securing intelligence, scientific knowledge, industrial capacity, and reliable allies. That shift can be seen in multiple documented cases, with Operation Paperclip, Unit 731, Japan's occupation in Western Germany. So, yeah, as the historian John Lewis Gaddis has observed in his work on the Cold War, strategic competition with the Soviet Union increasingly shaped American foreign policy after 1945. In practice, that often meant decisions that would have seemed unlikely if wartime accountability had remained the dominant objective. So, once the Cold War became the overriding strategic concern, it influenced decisions about prosecutions, intelligence cooperation, scientific recruitment, and alliances in ways that remain debated today. Yeah, pretty big deal, huh? Pretty big deal. Let those people off the hook because we're all the same. Well, they're all the same group of people working together, so of course they're always letting each other off the hook, right? So this is the interesting part, though. You know, the Nazis were the Japanese were part of the Nazis early on, and supposedly Japan did not join Germany because it accepted Nazi racial doctrine. It joined because the two governments had overlapping strategic interests. So, Japan and Nazi Germany were imperial powers trying to overturn an international order dominated by Britain, France, the United States, and the Soviet Union. Their partnership was based on enemies, territory, and resources, not racial consistency. So Japan, I don't know. I'll leave some of this stuff about Japan if you'd like to take a closer look. But the basic bottom line is this: Japan, the citizens, well, they didn't really go along with the whole Nazi thing, but they were together, right? And so it was Japan that bombed the U.S., bombed Pearl Harbor, but you know that was all a false flag, and that whole thing about bombing Pearl Harbor. I mean, the U.S. had a famous movie guy there on site when it got bombed, so that's why you have so many terrific photos because they just happened to have somebody from Hollywood there on site. So what they claim is this: after 1945, the United States quickly became more interested in turning Japan into a dependable American ally rather than continuing to emphasize Japan's alliance with Nazi Germany or fully exposing Japanese wartime crimes. So, yeah, Well, everybody has to have an excuse, right, when you're a criminal. Most criminals commit crimes and they always have excuses, right? They always have a plan cooked out in their minds, like, well, if we get caught, we're going to tell them this, we're going to report that. So, yeah, I see these just as like they sat around and cooked up some ways to cover up the crimes, right? And they claim it's because Japan occupied a critical position in Asia. The United States directly controlled the occupation. The emperor was retained. Yeah. How I saw this happen was this. I remember it very clearly because I was born in 1951, and the history that I remember was this, that after the war, Japan had done horrible things. No mention of all this other stuff, right? And that essentially the U.S. let Japan go back and be in Japan and make TVs, right? That was kind of how I understood this whole history, right? Uh, so, because Japanese atrocities received less sustained Western attention, Nuremberg, Hitler, and the European Holocaust became the dominant Western framework for remembering the war. The Nanjing Massacre, Unit 731, biological warfare, and abuses throughout occupied Asia were less central to the American public narrative, particularly when exposing them. Yeah, so the United States did not forget that Japan had joined Nazi Germany. It decided that post-war Japan was more valuable as an anti-communist military, economic, and political partner than as a permanently condemned former Axis enemy. In that sense, Japan's transformation was striking. In 1945, it was an enemy portrayed as fanatical and brutal. Within a few years, it was becoming the principal American base and partner in East Asia. The war had not become irrelevant, but strategic usefulness increasingly determined which parts of that history were emphasized and which were pushed into the background. Because World War II is often taught, especially in the United States. In the European war, the story is usually presented as Hitler, the Nazis, the Holocaust, D-Day, and Nuremberg. So yeah, in the Pacific War, the story becomes Pearl Harbor, island hopping, Tsujimas, Okinawa, Hiroshima, and Nagasaki. So I think that a lot of our history, we've been taught in these little boxes and stuff, right? But this is really how it actually worked. So, because that surprised me about how they actually cooperated, because Japan was fighting alongside Germany. The war ends. The United States grants immunity to key Unit 731 personnel in exchange for their research. The emperor remains on the throne. By the 1950s, Japan is becoming one of America's closest allies in Asia. That transformation happened astonishingly quickly. Yeah, quick as can be, right? So, if the post-war goal was universal justice, why did accountability take such different paths in Germany and Japan? So, Japan was formally allied with Nazi Germany and Fascist Italy. Japan signed the anti-pact with Germany in 1936 and this other pact in 1945, creating that axis. So, yeah, they just go in and decide who they're going to divide up is how it really happens. So anyways, I'm going to keep moving along from this because we go on and on about why they did this or that, but the facts remain the same, right? After the war, Japan became their friend, right? So anyways, most listeners know, most of us know where Japan ended up as a prosperous American ally famous for electronics and automobiles. Few have thought about how quickly that transformation occurred after Japan had been one of America's fiercest wartime enemies and a formal ally of Nazi Germany. So yeah, it did happen pretty quickly, right? And I'm going to conquer Italy next, and then I'll be taking a break. Now, why didn't Italy get any trouble? Well, this is a very interesting story. Italy is one of the most overlooked parts of the post-war story. Can you imagine that, right? Rome, Italy, Roma's Catholic Church. Italy did have trials, but it never had a single international tribunal like Nuremberg or Tokyo. Most large-scale prosecutions simply never happened. The major reasons were this: Italy switched sides before the war ended. That is probably the biggest reason. Mussolini was overthrown in July of 1943. Italy surrendered to the Allies in September of 1943. The new Italian government declared war on Germany. Italian troops fought alongside the Allies for the remainder of the war. That allowed post-war Italy to argue that, yeah, we were fascists, but we also helped defeat fascism. That was an argument that Germany and Japan could not make. So Italy became both defendant and victim. After September 1943, Germany occupied northern Italy. Italians fought Italians in a civil war. German troops committed atrocities inside Italy. Italian resistance groups fought the Germans. So Italy could then say, we committed some crimes, but we also suffered under Nazi occupation. So that complicated any attempt to stage one giant international trial. Mussolini was already dead. On April the 28th, 1945, Mussolini was captured. He was executed by Italian partisans. Several senior fascist officials were executed with him. Italy later argued that much of the principal leadership had already been punished by Italians themselves. And of course, the Cold War intervened again. By 1947, the Western Allies were increasingly worried about Soviet influence. Like they couldn't get those Russians out of their minds, right? They were worried about the powerful Italian Communist Party. Keeping Italy in the Western camp, justice became secondary to political stability. So Britain and the United States lost interest in prosecutions. Yugoslavia wanted hundreds of Italian officers extradited. Ethiopia wanted Italian commanders tried for poison gas, massacres, and colonial atrocities. Instead, Britain slowed things down. The U.S. withdrew support. Extraditions largely failed, so many suspects simply remained in Italy. So Italy declared a broad immunity. Italy declared a broad amnesty. In 1946, Justice Minister Togliatti issued a sweeping amnesty. Although intended to exclude the worst crimes, in practice, it was interpreted broadly. Boy, wasn't that convenient. Out of roughly 218,000 cases reviewed during the de-fascist process, only 738 resulted in convictions. So out of 100,000 cases, only 730 got convictions. Some officials were politically inconvenient to prosecute. One example is General Mario Roatta, R-O-A-T-T-A. Yugoslavia wanted him tried. Instead, he escaped with assistance from Italian police and British intelligence, eventually living in Spain before returning to Italy. Okay, so in Germany, they had extensive trials initially, then rapidly reintegration as the Cold War intensified. Japan, they used selective prosecutions, immunity for Unit 731, personnel, preservation of the emperor, alliance with the United States. Italy had limited prosecutions, broad amnesties, reluctant to extradite suspects, reconciliation prioritized over extensive trials. So I'm not laughing because it's funny. I'm laughing because, well, these patterns just seem to keep repeating, right? The elites and the royals and the people on their team always seem to escape the charges. So the specific circumstances differ, but by roughly 1947 to 1948, Western governments increasingly emphasized rebuilding allies and containing Soviet influence over pursuing every alleged war criminal. That shift is well documented, even though historians continue to debate whether it was justified or whether accountability should have remained the higher priority. Oh, God. Oh, let me read that last line because I couldn't stop laughing. So, by roughly 1947 to 1948, Western governments increasingly emphasized rebuilding allies and containing Soviet influence over pursuing every alleged war criminal. That shift is well documented, even though historians continue to debate whether it was justified or whether accountability should have remained the highest priority. Yeah, I mean, yeah, because they wrote the rules, right? How do you think all of them ended up so rich? Well, I mean, let's not be a bunch of dumbbells here because they print the friggin' money, right? So, they're not, these elites are not all rich because they're so fabulously smart and wonderful. They're rich because they cook up every deal and they print the money. So, and to show you how they all connect, I'm not going to be able to go into all of this, but uh, Joseph Goebbels ended up with a stepson, okay? His stepson was a man named Harald Quanti. All these names, why can't they give me a name like Smith, right? I'm having trouble enough speaking and they keep giving me these hard names. Okay, so let me tell you this story here. Joseph Goebbels had a stepson, okay? And his stepson was named Harold Quandt. It's Quandt. He is one of those remarkable historical figures whose life intersected with several major stories at once. He intersected with the Nazi leadership, the Battle of Crete, Monte Cassino, post-war German industry, and the modern BMW fortune. So let me just go through his list. So I'm just going to call him Harold because I can't pronounce the rest of it. So 1921, Harold is born. His father is a person called Gunther. The name was accused, one of Germany's wealthiest industrialists. His mother is Magna Quandt. Okay, so in 1929, his parents divorced. Magna remains part of Berlin's wealthy social circles. So then in 1931, Magna marries Joseph Goebbels. And so Harold suddenly becomes the stepson of one of Russia's closest associates. But remember, he came from a very wealthy industrialist family, right? 1933, Hitler comes to power. Harold now grows up in the center of the Nazi elite. He spends time with Adolf Hitler, Joseph Goebbels, Hermann Göring, and other senior Nazi leaders. Unlike many children, he personally knew the people running the Third Reich. So 1932 to 1940, excuse me, Magna and Goebbels have 6 children together. Harold becomes their older half-brother. The family is frequently photographed as the ideal Nazi family. Hitler reportedly has a warm relationship with the Goebbels children. So in 1939, Harold, who's now living with the Goebbels because his industrialist father, right, he volunteers for military service. Despite his family connections, he receives no exemption, and he joins the elite paratroopers. 1941, Harold fights for the invasion of Crete. The battle becomes one of the bloodiest airborne operations of the war. Harold survives and receives decorations for bravery. He serves on the Eastern Front. Later, he serves in Italy. By now, he's a commissioned officer. So yeah, Harold goes on, the story goes on for a bit, but basically what happened was that when Harold was in captivity, he supposedly got into captivity in April 1945 when Berlin collapses, right? His mother, who's now married to Joseph Goebbels, writes him what amounts to be a farewell letter. She explains she sees no future without National Socialism. The letter is one of the most haunting surviving personal documents from Hitler's bunker, if you believe the bunker was really true, right? So on May the 1st, 1945, Magna poisons all 6 of Harold's younger half-siblings. Joseph and Magna Goebbels then kill themselves. Harold becomes the only surviving child of Magna Goebbels. I told you the story, it's confusing. So in 1947, Harold is released from British captivity. He returns to Germany. Instead of entering politics, he joins the family business founded by his father, the guy that was divorced by Goebbels' wife. 1954, Gunther, the father, dies. Harold and his half-brother Herbert inherit enormous industrial holdings. These include major interests connected in what became BMW and other industrial firms. 1950 to 1960, the Quandt family, remember Harold's family, becomes one of the richest industrial dynasties in West Germany. Harold generally avoids public political discussion. Well, I think I would too if I was him. Unlike Albert Speer or others, he writes no major memoir. So, in the 60s, Harold's half-brother plays a decisive role in rescuing BMW from financial collapse by increasing the family's investment. Without Herbert's intervention, many historians believe BMW might have been absorbed by another company. 1967, Harold dies in a private plane crash in Italy. They're always dying in plane crashes, right? He is only 45 years old. So after 1967, his daughters inherit substantial wealth. The broader family fortune continues growing through BMW and other investments. So by 2007, a German television draws attention to the family's wartime history. Well, I'm not really sure the guy died in a plane crash in 1967. They probably staged it, right? Hey, they're starting to sniff around about what happened there in Germany. How about you just go and die in a little plane crash here? So anyway, the German documentary comes out, and this is just incredible to me that all this stuff got stolen in 1945 time reign, right? Now we're talking 2007. A German television draws renewed attention to the family's wartime history. It examines the use of forced labor in their factories during World War II. In 2011, an independent historical investigation commissioned by the family concludes that the Quandt companies used more than 50,000 forced laborers during the war, and that the family's wartime activities were more deeply intertwined with the Nazi system than had previously been acknowledged. Sounds to me like there was just kind of like a big cover-up for many years, right? So, what makes Harold historically unique? Well, he occupies an unusual position in history. He was the biological son of one of Germany's richest industrialists. He was the stepson of Joseph Goebbels. He personally acquainted with Hitler. He was an officer in an elite combat formation rather than a political official. He was a prisoner of war when Berlin fell. He was the only surviving child of Magna Goebbels, heir to one of Germany's largest post-war industrial fortunes. He entered the world at age 10 when his mother remarried. He then lived through the collapse of the regime, lost his mother and 6 half-siblings in a single day, spent years as a POW, and returned to inherit an industrial empire whose wartime legacy remained the subject of historical scrutiny. Few individual biographies intersect with so many of the defining themes of the 20th century German history. 1901, Magna Goebbels is born Magdalena. She grows up in a complicated family situation. For part of her youth, she lives in Brussels, where her mother later marries a Jewish businessman. Yeah, so, yeah, these people all, I mean, they connect so much that it's hard to really keep them straight, right? Um, when she got married to the quant guy, they said that her marriage on paper looked ideal. They had immense wealth, luxury homes, high social status, and one son. But it was reportedly not a happy marriage. Quant was much older than Magna and reportedly more reserved and business focused. Magna was socially ambitious and enjoyed politics, society, and public life. So yeah, and they both had several affairs. The marriage ended in divorce when Harold was only 8 years old. Initially, he spends considerable time with his father, and then he hangs out with the Goebbels and them. These people just all connect in such an unusual way, don't they? So yeah, and here again, what happened to prosecuting these people? Well, nothing, right? Most of them probably play acted like they were dead, right? I don't think that anybody in that bunker ended up dead. So yeah, but the amazing part is that here again, nobody got any charges, right? So anyways, because I believe that communism was a trick. Look at how well it worked. You get a bunch of criminals off the hook. The old divide and conquer still works. So containing communism became a remarkably effective umbrella explanation. It justified protecting Japanese biological warfare researchers, recruiting German scientists, rebuilding former Axis industrial networks, restoring compromised officials to government, and creating intelligence relationships with people who might otherwise have been prosecuted. So yeah, communism was a real political and military force. The Soviet Union, a communist parties, revolutions, intelligence operations, and geopolitical conflicts were not imaginary. But the threat of communism was also used repeatedly and selectively as a tool. It gave governments a ready-made reason to suspend accountability, hide embarrassing alliances, classify records, and recast former enemies as useful partners. So yeah, I think it created this divide and conquer they've been doing all along. The public was encouraged to see the world as two opposing camps, communism and anti-communism. Once that division was accepted, almost anyone on the correct side could be rehabilitated. A Nazi scientist, a Japanese human experimenter, a former fascist official, or an authoritarian ally could be treated as acceptable if he was useful against the designated enemy. If one believes the elite theories or Illuminati or whatever they're calling themselves, they always show that black and white checkerboard. That is a common theme in many elite conspiracies or Illuminati theories. The basic idea is that a population divided into competing groups is easier to govern or influence than a population acting together. The concept itself is much older than modern conspiracy theories. The principle of divide and rule was used in the ancient world and has long been associated with empires and political strategy. It generally means encouraging or maintaining divisions among groups so they are less able to unite against those in power. In contemporary discussions, people apply that framework in different ways. Some argue that political, racial, religious, or class conflicts are amplified because polarization benefits those with power or influence. Others argue that many of those divisions arise organically from genuine disagreements, historical injustices, economic interests, or social change, rather than from a single coordinating group. Well, I believe that it's been all set up. All this fear, right? Create the fear, and you got them under control. And all these other things that I can't get into right now, they got the whole world thinking this is their only life, right? if you think this is your only life, your decisions are going to be way differently than if you understand you have other lives. Why do you think I chose to hole up in my house with weapons and cameras versus just submitting to what they wanted me to do? Because why would I? Why would I, right? You have to learn to not be subservient to these people. So, yeah, all of this was used to get everybody. That's why they came up with the left versus right, black versus white people, rich versus poor people, urban versus rural people, religious versus secular people. And they even talk about some of us like, well, some of us are educated, the rest of you aren't. So if they keep the public focused on each other instead of scrutinizing governments, financial institutions, or other centers of power, but it is well documented. This isn't a speculation. Governments, political movements, intelligence agencies, and media organizations have at times used propaganda, identity appeals, or polarization to build support or weaken opponents. They're all ganging up doing that right now. They claim that Mitch McConnell may be dead. Well, there's actual news people that are saying, yep, I just talked to Mitch McConnell yesterday. Talked to him for 20 minutes. He was asking me how Iran is going. The guy is dead, okay? And they're all covering for him. So yes, this is not anything new. So I'm going to be taking a break here. And when I return, I will get into all this denazification, how that worked, how that basically kind of left all the same people in charge. So I'll be back on the other side. Okay, in this section, I'm going to be talking about denazification, how that all work out, and we'll finally get to Nuremberg. So, as the timeline goes, 1945, Germany surrenders. The Allies, United States, Britain, France, and the Soviet Union agree that Germany must be denazified so another Nazi regime cannot emerge. The goals: arrest and prosecute major Nazi leaders, remove Nazis from government, courts, police, schools, and universities, ban the Nazi Party and its organizations, eliminate Nazi symbols and propaganda, re-educate Germans about Nazi crimes, rebuild Germany as a democratic state. So then we have the Nuremberg trials. The top leadership was prosecuted, but only a relatively small number of senior figures faced the famous international trials. Millions of Germans had to complete detailed questionnaires about Nazi Party membership, SS or SA membership, government employment, military service, political activities, financial interests. People were then classified into categories ranging from major offender to exonerated. Initially, hundreds of thousands of people lost their jobs as teachers, judges, police officers, civil servants, government officials. The idea was to prevent committing Nazis from running the new Germany. So the Allied forces faced Germans to confront evidence of concentration camps, and this included newsreels, posters showing camp victims, visits to nearby camps, public discussions, new school curriculum. The objective was to demonstrate what had occurred under the Nazi regime and discourage renewed support for National Socialism. But there was a pretty big problem. Very quickly, the Allies discovered that millions of Germans had belonged to Nazi organizations. If everyone with party membership was permanently excluded, wait a second, I lost my place here for a second. Okay, so if everyone with party membership were permanently excluded, schools had almost no teachers, courts had almost no judges, ministries had almost no administrators, businesses had almost no experienced managers. The system became almost impossible to administer. But of course, the Cold War changes everything. Hip hip hooray for the Cold War. Around 1947 to 1948, priorities shifted dramatically. Instead of asking, how do we punish every Nazi? The question increasingly became, how do we build a strong West Germany to resist the Soviet Union? That single change altered much of post-war policy. Beginning in the late 1940s and early 1950s, large numbers of former Nazis were reclassified. Many paid only fines. Many returned to government service. Former judges became judges again. Former diplomats became diplomats again. Former teachers returned to those classrooms. West Germany Chancellor Konrad Adenauer argued that Germany needed reconciliation and experienced administrators rather than endless purges. His government passed amnesty laws that restored many former officials to public employment. The final outcome, denazification, permanently abolished the Nazi Party, Nazi laws, Nazi symbolism in government, Nazi political institutions. However, it did not permanently remove most former Nazis from German society. Many continued careers in government, industry, universities, intelligence, medicine, law, and business. This is why historians describe denazification as partially successful. It succeeded in destroying the Nazi state and preventing its return. Well, I don't know about that, but it did not comprehensively purge everyone who had participated in it. The onset of the Cold War, the need to rebuild Germany quickly. I'm sorry. The onset of the Cold War, the need to rebuild Germany quickly, and the practical reality that millions had been involved all contributed to a much more pragmatic outcome than had originally been envisioned. Held directly after World War II, the Nuremberg trials were a series of 13 military tribunals in which nearly 200 German government, military, medical, and business leaders were tried for war crimes. In the first and most famous of those trials, the trial of the major war criminals before the International Military Tribunal, 24 high-ranking Nazi officials, including Rudolf Hess, Hermann Göring, and Wilhelm Frick, were tried for crimes against humanity during the Holocaust. Nazi leader Adolf Hitler and two of his top associates committed suicide at the war's end. Many other party leaders escaped prosecution. In addition to bringing some of Nazi Germany's most monstrous figures to justice, the Nuremberg trials broke new ground in international law and helped lead to the United States United Nations Genocide Convention. And this is just fascinating, right? So, in addition to bringing some Nazi Germany's most monstrous figures to justice, the Nuremberg trials broke new ground in international law and helped lead to the United Nations Genocide Convention of 1948 and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights of 1948 and the Geneva Convention on the Laws and Customs of War in 1949. Nuremberg was chosen as the location for the trials because of its symbolic value. The Bavarian city that spawned the rise of the Third Reich by hosting massive Nazi rallies in the 1920s and 1930s was deemed by the victorious Allies to be a fitting place to stage its symbolic death. Although World War II had left much of the city in rubble, the Palace of Justice, which included a sizable prison capable of holding 1,200 detainees, remained largely undamaged and was chosen to host the trials once German prisoners completed the work of enlarging the courtroom. It was the first trial of its kind with judges from 4 countries. The Nuremberg trials marked a milestone in the establishment of international law. Where there had been prior prosecutions of war crimes in history, such as that of the Confederate Army officer Henry Wirz, Those had been conducted according to the laws of a single country. Until the Nuremberg trials, there had been no precedent for an international trial of war criminals. Rather than use a single judge and jury, the trial of high-ranking Nazi leaders was conducted by a panel of 4 judges. The United States, Soviet Union, France, and Great Britain each supplied a main judge and an alternate, and Britain's Lord Justice Geoffrey Lawrence presided. The Nuremberg trial served as a precedent for the subsequent prosecution of war crimes in Japan and led to the establishment of the UN, blah, blah, blah. So, excuse me. Let me see here. So, first, Nuremberg had a powerful historic identity. This is why they picked it, because of its identity and symbolism. During the medieval period, it was closely associated with the Holy Roman Empire. Many imperial assemblies were held there, and the city housed the imperial castle. Nazi propagandists portrayed the Third Reich as a successor to earlier German empires, making Nuremberg a useful symbolic stage. Second, the city was politically favorable to the Nazi movement. Franconian was an early Nazi stronghold under Julius Streicher, who enthusiastically supported holding large party events there. Third, Nuremberg already had the space needed for enormous rallies. Vast open areas allowed architect Albert Speer to design monumental structures like the Zeppelin Field and the Congress Hall. The rallies became increasingly elaborate propaganda spectacles. And once the rallies became famous, Nuremberg itself became part of the Nazi brand. The city hosted the annual party rallies from the 1920s through 1938, and in 1935, the racial legislation continued there because that became known as the Nuremberg Laws. Where the occult question comes in is that several senior Nazis genuinely were fascinated by mysticism. And I'm alleging that part of the reason they probably chose Nuremberg, it had to do with some sort of symbols. The most notable was Heinrich Himmler. He did all kinds of things in that castle. He had interest in Germanic mythology, ancient symbols, runes, folklore, and pseudo-history. He transformed Wieselberg Castle into a ceremonial SS center with symbolic architecture. Other figures, including Karl Maria Williget, promoted esoteric ideas within the SS. Williget also claimed mystical ancestral knowledge and influenced some SS symbolism. Astrology itself had a more complicated relationship with the regime. During the early years of the Nazi rule, some astrologers operated openly. However, after Rudolf Hess flew to Britain in 1941, Hitler reportedly blamed Hess's interest in astrologers and mystics for influencing the decision. The regime then cracked down on astrologers, occult societies, and many esoteric groups. So while individuals within the regime believed in these subjects, official policy became increasingly hostile toward independent occult practitioners. Could hidden symbolism still have influenced the choice of Nuremberger? It is possible in the broad sense that the Nazis loved symbolism. They deliberately used medieval imagery, torchlight processions, banners, eagles, runes, and architecture to create a quasi-religious atmosphere. One interesting point that is often overlooked is that the Nazis were masters of myth-making. They deliberately wrapped political decisions in references to history, destiny, and ancient German glory. Even without astrology, they wanted followers to feel that they were participating in something timeless and almost sacred. Nuremberg, with its imperial history and dramatic medieval settings, fit that narrative exceptionally well. The Nazis unquestionably embraced symbolism and myth. So yeah, they were all into that stuff, right? There was this person, and the word genocide also came out of Nuremberg. Didn't have the word before that. A prosecutorial advisor originated the term genocide. Raphael Lemkin, a Polish-born lawyer who served as an advisor to Jackson, is credited with coining the term genocide in 1944 to describe the Nazis' planned extermination of Jews. The word is an amalgam of genos, the Greek word for tribe or race, and cide, Latin for killings. Lemkin, who lost nearly 50 relatives in the Holocaust, defined genocide as a coordinated plan of different actions aimed at the destruction of essential foundations of the life of national groups, with the sum of annihilating the group themselves. Well, that's kind of what's going on right now to all the rest of us, right? The Nuremberg trials marked the first ever prosecutions for genocide. Who would have guessed? I would have thought they would have defined genocide way before 1944. So Munich was the birthplace of the Nazi Party. Hitler joined the German Workers' Party, or DAP, in Munich. 1920, it became the National Society German Workers' Party. 1923, the beer hall punch took place in Munich. Hitler often referred to Munich as the capital of the movement. So if someone is saying Nuremberg was the birthplace of Nazism, that's really not accurate. Nuremberg became the ceremonial and symbolic capital of the Third Reich. Beginning in the 1920s, and especially after 1933, the annual Nazi Party rallies were held there. Those rallies drew hundreds of thousands of participants and were carefully staged propaganda events. The city became the place where the regime celebrated itself before Germany and the world. And they actually had annual party rallies, construction of massive rally grounds designed by Albert Speer. The proclamation of the 1935 Nuremberg Laws happened there. Hitler's speeches presented the future of the Reich. Ceremonial displays of military and party unity. Because of this, many historians describe Nuremberg as the ceremonial capital of Nazism, the symbolic heart of the Third Reich, the city of the Nazi Party rallies, or the ideological showcase of Hitler's Germany. So, Munich was the birthplace of the Nazi movement. Nuremberg became its ceremonial capital and the symbolic stage on which the Third Reich presented itself to the German people and the world. So, let's talk a little bit about Nuremberg. I ran across this fascinating article called The Secret Art Bunker of Nuremberg. By the time the war broke out in 1939, Nazi officials had already developed a detailed plan for a network of tunnels to smuggle and hide valuable artwork. Though more than 1,800 people in Nuremberg, Germany died in a... Wait a minute. Okay, wait a second. Okay, I don't know what that's about. So anyway, let me continue on with this part of it. The Nazis used a medieval tunnel system underneath Nuremberg's imperial castle to hide the city's ancient treasures, including the imperial regalia of the Holy Roman Empire, valuable paintings, and even pieces of stained glass windows from local cathedrals. The underground maze had existed since the 14th century. Medieval workers used hammers and chisels to carve a labyrinth of tunnels and vaults underneath the castle hill. The naturally cool chambers had been used to store beer and vats of pickled cabbage. The tunnel system runs about 4 stories deep and spans an estimated total area of 6 acres, equating to a space of more than 6 football fields. By the time the war broke out in 1939, Nazi officials had already developed a detailed plan to preserve cultural treasures in Nuremberg held sacred by Hitler's Third Reich. These items included works of art, religious items, and artifacts made in Nuremberg, the former seat of the Holy Roman Empire. It was described since the 19th century as a treasury of the German Empire. Nuremberg was home to such notable artists as Albrecht Dürer, Hans Sachs, blah, blah, blah. The Nazis found propaganda value in Nuremberg's history and transformed it into the symbol of the Third Reich during the 1930s. City officials collaborated with Heinrich Himmler and the SS to hide artwork in the bunker. The storage site was designed by Dr. Konrad Fries, head of the city's air raid protection department, and architect named Dr. Heinz Schmeiser, head of the city's monument preservation department. The secret tunnel system was completely renovated within 6 months after the war began. Previously, the tunnels were used to store Nazi party rally equipment, including props, lighting, and allegedly a podium used by Hitler. Renovations transformed the tunnels into a state-of-the-art artifact preservation facility with air conditioning, ventilation, and moisture control systems and modern plumbing. Shock-resistant steel doors were designed to withstand bomb tremors. Guards kept watch in chambers equipped with bunks. The facility contained a wireless communication hub and an escape route with a ladder to the surface. 6 main chambers were used to store artwork. Artwork with cultural significance to the Third Reich was systematically removed during the war from Nuremberg and other German cities and from conquered territories and stored in the bunker. The hoard of items packed into the subterranean maze included historic armor and weapons, a globe created by Martin Behem in 1492, scientific instruments, manuscripts, statues, paintings, and drawings. The Nazis removed stained glass windows from Nuremberg's Frankenschutz and St. Lawrence cathedrals and packed them in carefully constructed wooden crates. Afterwards, they installed substitute glass in the windows and draped them with long flags to conceal the missing panes from view. Fountains and altarpieces were also stored in the bunker. Artwork was packed into padded boxes as protection from bomb blasts. The most famous items stored in the bunker were the imperial treasures called the Reichendeimers, which included the jeweled crown, scepter, and orb of the ancient Holy Roman Emperor. The Nazis removed these objects from Austria in 1938. Another high-profile item was the Marian altar created by famed German artisan Veit Stoss, stolen from Krakow Cathedral in Poland. According to post-war interviews conducted by the U.S. Army, various Nazi leaders worked together to confiscate and store the items, with Himmler and the SS playing a key role. Himmler ordered that the imperial treasures be kept in copper containers. Operations at the bunker were kept secret. Allied bombings in January and February of 1945 razed the Nazis' hollowed city to rubble, killing several thousand people and leaving more than 100,000 residents homeless. All artwork in the bunker was totally unscathed. More than 20,000 civilians huddled in a makeshift air raid beneath the city's square during Allied attacks, unaware of the bunker's existence. As Allied troops closed in at the end of March, Nazi officials frantically relocated the imperial treasures due to fear of looting. As houses were leveled, streets blocked with rubble, and city residents starved, Nazi extremists launched a crackdown to prevent surrender and nearly destroyed the art bunker. Fanatic Nazi politician Karl Holz commanded Nuremberg's defenses. He ordered that anyone caught attempting to flee the city, waving a white flag, or failing to report for work duties would be executed. Using city loudspeakers to spread terror, Holtz declared, "Who does not want to live with honor must die in shame," and referred to the Allies as devils. On Holtz's orders, 4 Nuremberg residents were publicly executed for disgrace, and an additional 35 citizens were sent to Dachau concentration camp for alleged defeatism. Holtz planned to drastically enforce Hitler's Nero decree, which called upon Germans to self-destruct rather than surrender. As American troops closed in on the outskirts of Nuremberg, Holtz prepared to deploy demolition teams to blow up whole sections of the city, including the art bunker, according to later testimony by city official Albert Deichen. Holtz's plan to destroy the art bunker was allegedly the last straw for city mayor Willy Liebel, a close associate of Albert Speer. Liebel had deported Jews and helped implement Nuremberg's racist laws, yet switched sides when confronted with the possible destruction of German artwork in the bunker. As American troops entered the eastern outskirts of the city on April the 20th, 1945, Liebel took refuge in a shelter below city police headquarters and attempted to contact the U.S. Army to negotiate surrender. Hearing of this, Holtz entered the room and shot the mayor in his head. Excuse me. So, Holtz hears this and comes in and shoots the guy in the head, and then he claimed that Liebel committed suicide. And then Holtz ordered troops in the city to hold the last man. The resulting siege cost many lives on both sides during fierce house-to-house fighting. Ultimately, Holtz was killed during a standoff with American soldiers after refusing 4 chances to surrender. Following a victory celebration on the city's main square, American troops moved into Nuremberg Castle and discovered the steel doors of the secret art bunker. The U.S. Army launched an investigation under the leadership of German-born U.S. intelligence officer and monuments man, Lieutenant Walter William Horn. An art expert, Horn had attended Heidelberg University and immigrated to the U.S. due to his opposition to Nazism. Horn interrogated 21 people in Nuremberg, including 2 city councilors. After conducting hard rounds of cross-examinations, Horn learned the location of hidden imperial treasures. Nazi officials confessed to hiding the items behind a wall in the civilian air raid shelter, 80 feet below ground. According to Horn's investigation, the Nazis planned to use the imperial treasures as symbols to inspire a future resistance movement. All works of art and cultural items stored in the secret art bunker of Nuremberg were eventually returned to the places they had occupied before the war. Due to bomb damage, it took more than 70 years before various historical objects could be displayed in restored buildings in Nuremberg. Despite protests from city residents, including these other people, let me see, the Holy Roman Empire treasures were returned to Vienna. Yeah, same place they decided we were all crazy, right? So, yeah. So, yeah, Hitler did all that. So, yeah, that's why they like Nuremberg. Nuremberg, the city represented the medieval Holy Roman Empire, which was, and I'll get back to this Reich business, but yes, it was the first Reich in Nazi historic mythology. So, yeah, because all this Reich business, I'll give you a very simplified thing before I get to it later. I mean, not later today, but later in the future. Here's a simplified version of this Reich business. We all heard about the Third Reich, right? But where'd they get that from? Well, they didn't get it at the time as a Reich. So it kind of got positioned together later on, kind of a, well, I would consider it kind of a fishy deal. But so anyway, so here's the bottom line. the First Reich was really held during the Holy Roman Empire. And that's as far as we want to go right now to not complicate things, okay? But they didn't identify these things as Reichs until the Third Reich. So before all that, nobody said anything about Reichs, okay? And then looking back, they said, oh yeah, well maybe in Rome, maybe that we should call that a Reich. So not to confuse the issue, but the Reich part of this whole thing came along during Nazi Germany, and then they kind of backtracked it and said, yeah, okay, well, because during the Holy Roman Empire, they did not call it a Reich. What they did was they looked back and said, yeah, we'll be the Third Reich. And oh, yeah, the first two, they came out of this one, that place. So, yeah, it's all kind of, well, it's a little bit weird. But anyway, so obviously there's a lot of reasons why they would be hanging around Nuremberg, right? They have the Holy Roman Empire back. It was the First Reich in Nazi historical mythology. Always look for that word, mythology, right? Just like in World War II, you'll read much more about firebombing than you will nuclear bombs, right? So just pay attention to how the words work. So anyway, so what also did Nuremberg represent? Well, the imperial continuity and the annual party rallies and the proclamation of the 1935 Nuremberg Laws. So when you hear Nuremberg, most people just zip right to the trials, but Nuremberg is actually, I mean, I consider it very significant. I certainly wouldn't have dug this deep into it. Anyhow, so the most significant objects they had were the imperial crown, this thing they called the orb, the scepter, the imperial sword, other ceremonial objects of the Holy Roman Emperors. Now, were they really objects of the Holy Roman Emperors? Who knows, right? Who knows? But they had supposedly been kept in Vienna for more than a century until Hitler annexed Austria in 1938. Hitler ordered them brought back to Nuremberg because he believed they belonged in the city that symbolized the old German Empire. So, yeah. And the bunker itself was remarkably sophisticated, because the original castle dated back to the 14th century. So they had, back then in 1939, they had climate control, they had ventilation, they had moisture regulation, they had shock-resistant doors, guard rooms, communication equipment, escape routes. So yeah, it was pretty sophisticated. They were going to hang on to that stuff no matter what, right? So, anyway, so let me take a break here. Oh, let me see. Yeah, so after the capture of Nuremberg, American officers from the Monuments, Fine Arts, and Archives program investigated the bunker. One of the key figures was Walter William Horn. So yeah, he investigated this stuff. So I would say there's millions of reasons why they would do that. And let me connect this with the Taylor Swift wedding. Well, it was all about astrology, because I kept hearing people saying, well, why wasn't it handled in a castle? Why didn't they rent a private island? Why did they have it there? Who were all these celebrities that she didn't even seem to know? Well, because it was some sort of a ritual. And I realized that Madison Square Garden is on 33rd Street. And the interesting part that I found hysterical is that the first Madison Square Garden was founded by P.T. Barnum, the circus act, right? Taylor also had a secret garden there, right? And she's also transgender. I have a picture of her with a penis. So yeah, I'm sure she's transgendered, right? Taylor Swift, essentially, the Britney Spears family cooked up Britney Spears. They came out of Louisiana. They were poor, okay? Taylor Swift's family came out of the East Coast, money, okay? The dad's some sort of stock market guy and that kind of stuff. So she was born and she was created, right? They put her into country music to get her into the music industry. It wasn't like all the stories you've heard. So anyway, so at this wedding, I'm reading about, well, they had a special secret garden. Well, these are all ritual things, okay? And so then, and also the Scottish Rite has an honorary 33 degree, which is the highest honorary degree in that rite. And that is exactly why they use the number 33. It's treated as a master number. The number also appears in other religious and cultural contexts, such as the traditional age of Jesus Christ at the crucifixion, and the use of sets of 33 prayer beads in some Islamic devotional practices. Yeah, they basically, they've taken over these religions. So, yeah, the prayer beads in some Islamic traditions have 33 beads. Jesus Christ had the same connection, right? Well, I would argue to say that these people likely wrote that Bible. Now, it's not a popular opinion of mine, but it is a true opinion of mine. I believe 100% the Bible is like their movie script for how all this stuff unfolded. So, yeah, so she has a wedding. The theme was secret gardens and hidden spaces. Madison Square Garden is bordered by 31st and 33rd Street, with its main address on 7th Avenue. The original Madison Square Garden was developed by P.T. Barnum and opened in 1879 on Madison Avenue and 26th Street. Barnum converted the former railroad depot into an arena. The current Madison Square Garden is the fourth building to use the name, and this one opened in 1968 at its present location above Penn Station. The wedding theme was secret gardens or hidden spaces or similar imagery. Those are long-standing motifs in literature and design. So, yeah, I think it was an Illuminati meeting, and it was like some sort of they all consider themselves connected by bloodlines. And the simple way to think about it is this, and this is and this may sound really, really ruthless of me, but, I'll say it, okay? I think what happens was this: when these gypsies came over here, what they did was they put the better looking ones, okay, and more talented ones, right? More creative ones. Those people got sent to Hollywood. And let's say maybe the less attractive ones and more difficult ones, they got sent to be politicians. And maybe the ones that kind of bridge the gap are kind of charming, not as ugly looking as the politicians, but kind of didn't fit the Hollywood role, but they could run the corporations. And that's exactly how I think this whole thing got shifted out. So, while we're on that subject, let me get to the real subject here. Fascism. Where do we even... These days, all you hear is the word fascism. Donald Trump is a fascist. No, you're a fascist. No, they're using Nazi. Everywhere you look, they're talking about fascism. And so let's get straight with the word. Fascism comes from the Italian word fascismo, which in turn comes from faccio, meaning bundle or group. The deeper origin is the Latin word fasces, F-A-S-C-E-S. Fascism is a far-right, authoritarian, ultra-nationalist political ideology and system of government that places the nation or race above the individual and seeks a powerful, centralized state led by a strong leader. It rejects liberal democracy, political pluralism, and often suppresses dissent through force. So you can have authoritarian leadership. Power is concentrated in a single leader or ruling party with limited checks on authority. Well, one could argue that's where we are right now, right? The United States lost the war. Donald Trump can do whatever he wants. All that Congress stuff is just kind of like dressing, right? So another one could be extreme nationalism. The nation is portrayed as superior and in need of unity, strength, and often expansion. So yeah, and they also can have glorified military, occult leader states. But, so historically, the most prominent fascist regimes were Benito Mussolini's Italy, which gave the ideology its name from the Italian word fascismo, which I find fascinating. So why exactly, did this word happen to come out of Italy, right? Roma, Italy, right? Like those Roma gypsies. So the word fascism starts off in Italy. Adolf Hitler's Germany, where fascism took the form of Nazism, adding a central emphasis on racial ideology, anti-Semitism, and genocide. So, supposedly, democracy protects competitive elections, civil liberties, and limits on government power. Authoritarianism is a broader category of governments that concentrate power, and not all authoritarian regimes are fascist. Communism is based on class struggle and collective ownership, whereas fascism generally preserves private property under state direction and emphasizes nationalism rather than class. So they claim that all came out of Rome, okay? And then the Italian word comes to be in the 1800s. Mussolini gets the word in 1990, and onward, fascism becomes a word. So that's interesting. It didn't even start till then. And I've spoken briefly about this in the past, but I'll cover it since we're trying to put everything into context these last couple of shows. According to the late Jesuit priest, Friar Alberto Riviera, whose job was to infiltrate and destroy Protestant ministries, he was privy to sensitive Vatican briefings and documents. He revealed the Jesuit role in backing Hitler. So the Jesuits backed Hitler, okay? Furthermore, he was told by Cardinal Augustine Villa that Nazi gold was deposited in Vatican accounts in Swiss banks. Probably very likely, right? According to the late Jesuit priest, Friar Alberto Riviera, a fellow Jesuit named Friar Stempfenfeld wrote Mein Kampf as the stage was being set for Germany's new Roman Catholic star, Adolf Hitler. So yeah, I think that is probably a very true story, that just like today, your politicians don't write those fancy proposals and stuff. They get written by lobbyists, people who don't have your best interests at heart. So these patterns don't really strike me as being like really strange, right? Let me do this boot click business and I'll close off this file. The Nazi boot click was known as the pretty much or heels click. Military personnel would snap their heels together sharply while standing in attention or while giving a salute. It came from older Prussian and German military drill traditions that predated the Nazi regime by many decades. The Nazis adopted it as part of their emphasis on discipline, obedience, and military ceremony. The Wizard of Oz, Dorothy, clicks her heels 3 times in a magical gesture. The film never explains why 3 clicks are required, but it draws on long-standing folklore in which shoes or repeated actions have magical power. When Dorothy Gale clicks her ruby slippers together and repeats, "There's no place like home," it activates the magic that returns her to Kansas. So I don't know. The first sign of this stuff happened in Prussia, where they were clicking their heels, and they also clicked their heels during ballroom dancing. So the Nazis did not invent that heel click, but it's really prominent in your mind, right? You think about the Nazis and they're doing that goose leg stepping and all that stuff. Yeah. So that's the Nazis, and they click those heels. And the reason I bring up the click is because in abuse cases during the MK Ultra times, there's allegations, and remember, I'm just speaking allegations, that Josef Mengele was here in the United States, and people have identified him as Dr. Green or Dr. White. I think it's more commonly he's been called Dr. Green. So there have been allegations that people have brought up that during different things going on in this country where they were doing MK Ultra on people, that people reported that their doctor was actually Mengele, but his name was being called Dr. Green. And what they all talked about was this: Dr. Green clicked his heels. He walked in and he clicked his heel. So, I love odd details. So I don't know. Why did Dorothy click her heels, and specifically 3 times? Why did they add the, and also the Soviets are big on this heel clicking stuff. So if the Soviets were really your enemy, why would you goose step and click your heels like the Germans were doing, right? See, they all got the heel clicking part. So I don't know. It's a weird detail, but there's something. Maybe they think themselves are they're envisioning some sort of magic when they go and click their heels or something. I don't really know. It's kind of an open item, right? So, well, anyways, when I return, we're going to be talking about some pretty serious stuff because I want to go over this stuff with Bayer Aspirin and the Bayer Company, and it's a remarkable story because I'm trying to pick out one story per category. Like I have one story for that guy who was a stepson and became the billionaire, and this is a great story about Bayer Aspirin and IG, the people that came out of Nazi Germany, and well, they ended up being very wealthy, and well, they're still in control now because they're right now pushing for immunity, total immunity, so that all their chemical stuff they want to spray everywhere will have no repercussions. So there's been a recent Supreme Court ruling, and it gave pesticide giants Bayer, Monsanto total immunity. So yeah, it's not looking good for the rest of us on this game board with this deal going on. I mean, they're really calling all out assault, if you ask me, because now they're saying, hey, you know all those chemicals we were warning you about during Germany? We're unleashing all of them on all of you. Well, it's true, because that's why I'm so sick, because the sulfur exposure in my house is so great still that, yeah, it's crazy. I don't want to, every time I pick up the microphone, start talking about how I'm feeling, but yeah, I'm definitely having some neurological issues. That's why I'm trying to record these shows as quickly as I can, because is the neurological stuff going to get worse like quickly, or is it going to be this way for a few weeks? I don't really know. And that's why I'm sure they pick sulfur, because everything is different, right? That's why they have a million categories for Alzheimer's and dementia now. And that's why sulfur fits into it, because there's so many things. Like one day you feel like you can't see straight, the next day you got this going on. So yeah, it is completely sulfur. So I'm here to tell you that the people who brought us all these dangerous chemicals out of Germany, the IG Farber people, well, excuse me, well, they're alive and running today. And to what this says to me is significant. What it says to me is that they're really pulling the mask off on this deal, right? They tried the big kill with those vaccines recently. Now they're pulling the mask off and they're saying, hey, you people, we're going to spray this stuff wherever we want, because really this is about the United States. I've been saying this for years. The United States is in the kill box seat, right? We are an experiment, and that experiment is getting ready to be killed off soon. So anyhow, so let me take a break and I'll come back and we'll talk more about, because I want to make it very clear about these IG Farber people, okay? Because it's easy for them to position it and make no connections, but I'm telling you, they connect, okay? They connect. And they were one of the most significant people of the Nuremberg trials. So, yeah. 24 IG Farber executives were charged with war crimes and crimes against humanity during the Nuremberg trial. And if the trials were rigged, you got to kind of wonder. I think these people became like sacrificial to the public. Like, okay, you know those dangerous chemical people, the IG Farber people? It's okay. We got it covered. We took care of them during the Nuremberg trials. But it's alive and coming back today. And it'll take me a little bit of talking to get you through, because I had to really do some maneuvering to figure out, okay, what year was it IG Farber? What year was it this? And also, they also, Bayer Aspirin were part of what killed probably more people during the Spanish War than people that just, a lot of people on social media, they do their research on social media, so they miss a lot of key facts, right? Well, more people were likely killed during the Spanish flu by Bayer Aspirin than the vaccines that everybody claims that killed them all, because those vaccines and stuff, they did start off with the killers and stuff, right? So, yeah, during that whole period of the Spanish flu, likely Bayer Aspirin got more people than vaccines. So, yeah, and the same people, the Bayer Aspirin people are still, well, they're going to be free from any kind of charges or anything. So to me, it looks like, no, I've been trying to research psychopaths the last 30 years. To me, the fact that the Supreme Court and all these people are saying, yep, we're going to make it so they don't ever have to have any charges. It appears to me like Nazi Germany is here in the United States, and the gunning of these chemicals is only going to get worse, right? That is, if everybody just still sits on their couches and nobody does anything to stop these people. So it appears to me the master plan that started in Germany, to get rid of the rest of us, is now kind of coming full circle with this stuff going on with Bayer aspirin. So I need to take a break and explain this when I feel much more rested, because I don't want to be skipping over things, because I consider this whole deal with IG Farben to be pretty significant. And it's just a spoke in this wheel of what I'm trying to talk about with the amnesty and all this stuff at Nuremberg, because I believe that, well, did they really get sent to prison when they got charges at Nuremberg? Well, I kind of doubt it, right? So I believe that Nuremberg became bait for these people so they could say, yeah, we put away those people. But interestingly enough, they raised their ugly heads and they have never gone away. And that's how you start to connect these people together. They're all together in on this deal. So let me come back on the other side. Okay, in this segment, I'm going to be talking about IG Farben that became Bayer aspirin, and then we'll also get to Josef Mengele's mentor. I tried to pick out a couple of stories that would make sense to this whole thing, and as far as I can tell, IG Farben kind of got a pretty big deal out of Nuremberg, and they're still existing today, so it gives us a pretty good example of how this all worked out. So in 1945, Germany surrendered, and the Allies seized IG Farben because it had been deeply involved in the Nazi war economy, including the production of synthetic fuel, synthetic rubber, and other wartime materials. 1947 to 1948, the IG Farben trial was held at one of the subsequent Nuremberg trials. 24 IG Farben executives were charged with war crimes and crimes against humanity. 1951 to 1952, the Allies ordered IG Farben broken apart. And the companies were Bayer, a company called BASF, and Hoesch, Hoesch, which later became part of Aventis and then Sanofi. So during the 1946 to 1949 period, it was still IG Farben. Bayer did not yet exist, again, as an independent company. Bayer was then recreated by IG Farben and was dismantled beginning in 1951. So essentially how it went was this: 1946 to 1949 were the subsequent Nuremberg trials. There were doctors' trials, judges' trials, the IG Farben trial, Krupp trial, this other trial. Industrials, military leaders, judges, physicians, and SS officials were tried during that period. So that's when in 51 and 52, IG Farben was dismantled. But that left Bayer, that company BASF, and Hoesch to reestablish as independent companies. So they really, I don't know, it didn't look like they got much of a punishment because they got to reestablish, right? So, then moving forward, 2018, Bayer aspirin completed its acquisition of Monsanto for approximately $63 billion. After the acquisition, Monsanto ceased to exist as a separate company. Probably a good idea because of the name, right? And they also retired the Monsanto corporate name, and Bayer became the owner of Monsanto's seed and agriculture biotechnology businesses. So this includes the herbicide brand Roundup, which Bayer now owns and markets. So basically, that Bayer also gets in trouble for Zyklon B. Now, the camps and all that weren't necessarily true, so let me just explain a little bit about the Zyklon business. The active ingredient in Zyklon B was hydrogen cyanide, or HCN, absorbed into a porous carrier material. It was originally developed in the 1920s as a commercial fumigant to kill mosquitoes, insects, lice, and rodents in warehouses, ships, grain stores, and buildings. So, IG Farben did not manufacture Zyklon B directly. So, basically, there was a major company within the IG Farben corporate structure. So IG Farben built and operated the massive Buna synthetic rubber and fuel plants adjacent to Auschwitz. The company relied extensively on forced labor from Auschwitz prisoners. So basically, Bayer was found in Barmen, which is in Germany, initially produced synthetic dyes. Late 1800s and early 1900s, Germany becomes the world leader in chemical manufacturing. The stuff that's killing us right now. Companies such as Bayer, BASF, AGPA, and others dominate dyes, pharmaceuticals, and industrial chemicals. So then moving along, early 1900s, exactly February 1918, there was when the United States entered World War I in April 1917, the fledgling pharmaceutical industry had something they had never had before, a large supply of human test subjects during the years of 1918 to 1919. The U.S. Army ballooned to 6 million men, of which 2 million were sent overseas. The Rockefeller Institute for Medical Research took advantage of this new pool of human guinea pigs to conduct vaccine experiments. There's another Gates involved here. It's Dr. Frederick L. Gates. So according to Gates, they injected random doses of an experimental bacterial meningitis vaccine into soldiers. Afterwards, some of the soldiers had symptoms that were characterized as simulated meningitis. But Dr. Gates advances a fantastical claim that it wasn't actually meningitis. So there was a book written about this, and they said by some strange coinkydink, even modern technology was not able to pinpoint the killer influenza strain from this pandemic. The Spanish flu attacked healthy people in their prime. Bacterial pneumonia attacks people in their prime. Flu attacks the young, old, and immunocompromised. In actuality, bacterial pneumonia was a real killer, and thousands of autopsies confirm this fact. According to a 2008 National Institute of Health paper, bacterial pneumonia was the killer in a minimum of 92.7% of the autopsies of those died during the Spanish flu between 1917 and 18. It is only in the last few decades that researchers have connected aspirin use to increase in influenza mortality. Recently, influenza deaths have been attributed to what's called saccharin toxicity. Saccharins are weak acids that cross cell membranes relatively easily. Thus, they are more toxic when blood pH is low. With dehydration, hypothermia, and constant chronic ingestion increase saccharin toxicity because of the greater distribution of saccharin to tissues. So the most common saccharin is aspirin, but the group also includes, something about bismuth, such as Pepto-Bismol. Drugs that decrease respiratory drive should be avoided if possible because they may impair hyperventilation and respiratory alkalosis, decreasing blood pH. So stay away from those things. From the 1950s to the 1980s, thousands of deaths among children following influenza and other infections called Rey syndrome were unexplained until studies identified aspirin as a major contributor. Rey syndrome toxicity, which is vomiting, hyperventilation, delirium, and coma with brain swelling and fat in the liver and proximal renal tubules, develops after approximately 4 days. So this is crazy. So after 4 days of taking aspirin therapy, you can get vomiting, hyperventilation, delirium, coma, brain swelling, and fat in the liver and proximal renal tubules. 4 days with reportedly this is very poorly written. I'm having enough trouble speaking without trying to read a page that has its own grammar problems. Okay, so 4 days of salicylate therapy, which is aspirin, with reported daily doses of 25 milligrams adults. So adults with saccharine toxicity present mainly with abnormal consciousness and respiratory distress. Well, you also get those things from sulfur too. Okay, so they also did a 2009 study by the Infectious Disease Society of America called Aspirin Misuse Must Have Made the 1918 Flu Pandemic Worse. And that was published in October the 3rd, 2009. So autopsy reports from 1918 are consistent with what we know today about the dangers of aspirin toxicity, as well as the expected viral causes of death. In 1918, physicians did not fully understand either the dosing or pharmacology of aspirin, yet they were willing to recommend it. Its use was promoted by the drug industry, endorsed by doctors wanting to do something, and accepted by families and institutions desperate for hope. An abstract from the aforementioned study states that physicians of the day were unaware that the regimens produced levels associated with hyperventilation and pulmonary edema in 33 and 1/3% of recipients, respectively. In 1918, the U.S. Surgeon General, the U.S. Navy, and the Journal of American Medical Association recommended use of aspirin just before the October death spike. The hypothesis presented is that saccharine therapy for influenza during the 1918 to 1919 pandemic resulted in toxicity and pulmonary edema, which contributed to the incident and severity of the ARDS-like lungs. So yeah, I think that they just gave all those soldiers and stuff a whole bunch of aspirin, right? And people today still get this part confused. They want to blame it all on the vaccines, but really it was those simple little aspirins, right? So anyway, so I have all of the, what they found was also those anti-inflammatory drugs. Those things are really dangerous. That's why you can buy them over the counter, because they're so dangerous. Hey, just buy them over the counter. They got to be safe, right? No, they're actually quite dangerous. Over 100,000 people are hospitalized for GI bleeding, and of those, 16,500 die every year. And these values are considered conservative. So, also, the figures also include prescription they're called NSAIDs. So they're used to treat arthritis and all kinds of things. So, yeah, I would be very careful taking aspirin if I were you, or any of those other things like ibuprofen. So anyway, so that is Bayer aspirin. Now, I have everything you ever want to know about Bayer aspirin. Historians have studied IG Farben. IG Farben is frequently discussed because it illustrates how a large technologically advanced corporation became intertwined with a totalitarian state. Questions historians continue to examine include corporate responsibility during wartime, the use of forced labor, relationships between industry and government, post-war accountability, and how successor companies addressed or did not address their historical legacy. Whether one is studying business history, World War II, or ethics, IG Farben remains a central case because of its scale in scientific achievements and its involvement in some of the darkest chapters of the Nazi era. Yeah, because in 1925, they all formed under this IG Farben to create one of the largest chemical corporations. And they were doing the pharmaceuticals, the dyes, the fertilizers, the explosives. Yeah. So it employed tens of thousands of people and became deeply ingratiated into Germany's economy. 1933 to 1945, under the Nazi regime, IG Farben became a major industrial partner. So they manufactured synthetic fuel and rubber essential to Germany's war effort. They invested heavily in the Auschwitz industrial complex. They used forced labor from concentration camp prisoners. They conducted businesses with the Nazi government throughout the war. Just all around good people, aren't they? And how exactly do you define a psychopath? Well, I would say somebody who does all those things, right, at the expense of everybody else. That happens when you don't have a conscience, right? And that defines you as a psychopath. So 1945, Germany is defeated. The Allies investigate IG Farben's wartime activities. Yeah, I'm sure they investigated it really heavily. And they put those IG Farben executives on trial during the subsequent Nuremberg trials. So they didn't really even hit the main trial, the trial stage. They got shoved off to where the doctors and stuff were getting trialed. I have a very interesting story here about the doctors in a bit here. So, yeah, those doctors. Yeah, I have a story here that I'll tell you in a little bit about the guy that was heading up the psychiatric doctors. He seemed a little nuts himself, but I'll have to get to that in a minute here. So anyways, one other thing I want to address that I didn't cover in the last show was about the salute. Heil Hitler! Heil Hitler! Well, Hitler didn't give the same salute. I always thought he looked kind of gay. I mean, I'm not trying to bash gay people, but I mean, Hitler kind of raised his arm up and flapped his little wrist around. It looks kind of like something a gay guy would invent, but that was his return salute. Return salute. So Hitler was usually returning the salute rather than initiating it. During rallies, thousands of party members, soldiers, and civilians would salute him simultaneously. Rather than extending his full arm, this thing is badly written. I can't figure what they're trying to say here. The bottom line is this. Hitler didn't give a full salute. They called it his return salute. And I call it something that, I don't know, a really effeminate man would do, the way he flips his wrist around. But anyway, take a look at it yourself. They said there was a theatrical element. Hitler and his propaganda team carefully choreographed his public image. Small gestures, pauses, and movements were practiced extensively. His shortened statue became part of the recognizable visual style captured in countless photographs and films produced under the supervision of Joseph Goebbels and the propaganda ministry. So he's actually acknowledging others' salute rather than giving one himself when he gives that kind of limp wrist. So anyway, yeah, I'm going to put this on hold for a second. And while we're recapping things, don't forget that in the 1930s, Ukraine got starved. It was called the Holodrom. They pretty much starved out the people there. And it took them years to call that a genocide. So what they're doing is setting up with psychological warfare. And I read a piece recently which got me looking into this, because Putin is now claiming that in Ukraine they're dumping carcasses near the water supplies, okay? So I took a look at I know why they would do it, because they're evil, but why would you do something like dumping animals there, right, by the water supply? Well, it leaves a pretty big message, right? Because obviously they could go around and put some drops in something, right? Probably have the same effect from their pharmaceutical friends. But what they do is they just put dead animals to pollute the land and pollute the thing. Remember, they've been talking about using things to pollute the land so they could just grab it, right? Well, this is kind of partly a thing like that. According to the UK Department of Environment, Food and Rural Affairs, the infection begins with severe breathing issues. And when you contact any of these dead animals lying around, direct contact causes skin lesions with black centers. Though early antibiotic treatment can cure the skin infection, the true danger comes from breathing in the spores, which damages the lungs and kills in about 90% of the cases. They really want us breathing in this stuff. It's like this sulfur in my house. I mean, you're breathing it in and day out, right? So Historically, there are documented examples of attempts to contaminate or deny resources. During the medieval period, armies sometimes threw animal carcasses into wells to foul water supplies. In the early 20th century, several countries researched biological warfare, including anthrax. The Japanese biological warfare program carried out documented biological attacks in China during the Second Sino-Japanese War, including the use of anthrax and other pathogens. During the Cold War, both the United States and the Soviet Union maintained offensive biological weapon programs before later agreeing to prohibit them. Well, I don't think anything has really been fallen into place, right? So I'm just putting this out there because when they start talking about these things, you need to really kind of perk up your ears, right? Because along with this psychological damage, they also radiological contamination or dirty contamination rather than nuclear explosions. We're getting hit more with things that aren't as, let's say, as dramatic or as well played out. In other words, dirty electricity coming into your home isn't the same thing in people's minds as seeing a big bomb explode somewhere, right? Because they don't really picture that bomb being inside their house. So I'm going to be just leaving this alone here because I want you to be aware that that's what they're talking about now, poisoning the water, okay? Just pay attention to that. So anyway, so I don't know why I had that in the middle of there. I must have been very concerned about the other day. But anyway, so moving along, let's get to the really interesting part. How a psychiatrist at Nuremberg got inside the Nazi mind. That's the name of this article. Assigned to evaluate the Third Reich's top leaders ahead of the Nuremberg trials, American Douglas Kelly probed how ordinary men could commit extraordinary evil. Well, I would argue that these were not ordinary men to start with, right? They were psychos to begin with. But let me keep reading here. When the Allies prepared to put Nazi Germany's top leaders on trial at Nuremberg after World War II, the U.S. Army tapped a young psychiatrist, Captain Douglas McGlasson Kelly, for an extraordinary assignment. Kelly's task was to assess and preserve the mental stability of the captured Nazi elite, men like Hermann Göring and Rudolf Hess, as they awaited judgment for war crimes that had shaken the world. Kelly, who had been overseeing psychiatric services for thousands of GIs, was surprised by the order. He had no experience with war criminals, writes Jack in his book, 23 book, The Nazis and the Psychiatrist. Nor did he have experience with addiction withdrawal, an issue Göring in particular was struggling with. But Kelly quickly recognized the opportunity. Rather than just look after the prisoners, he envisioned a far more ambitious project, probing deep into the Nazi mind, looking for an explanation of how anyone could commit the heinous deeds these men were accused of. Were the Nazi leaders somehow different from the rest of humanity? His conclusions would make him one of the most controversial figures in the history of psychiatry, and later play a role in a shocking personal tragedy that he had later. Kelly called Nuremberg a psychiatrist's playground. Kelly reported for duty in Montfort, a small resort town in Luxembourg, in August of 1945, the same month he turned 33. The Americans had established a top-secret interrogation center there and converted a one-time hotel into a prison nicknamed Camp Ashcan for captured Nazis. Among its occupants were Admiral Karl Donitz, who had briefly become Germany's head of state after the suicide of Adolf Hitler, and Hermann Göring, Hitler's longtime second-in-command, who would have succeeded Hitler had the two not had a falling out in the final days of the war. In preparation for their war crimes, the army soon transferred Göring and other Nazi leaders to a prison in the bomb-flat city of Nuremberg, Germany. Kelly moved with them, responsible for interviewing and producing mental evaluations of 22 prisoners prior to trial. He began to study them as subjects, as a biologist might scrutinize animals confined in laboratory cages. For Kelly, the prison was a psychiatrist's playground. When Hitler and several of his key subordinates, either dead by suicide or rumored to have escaped to South America or elsewhere, Göring was the most famous Nazi in captivity. He was also the one Kelly spent the most time with, keeping copious notes on their conversations. The two men shared several traits. Both could be charming and cleverly manipulative. Both had narcissistic tendencies. In Göring's case, that included a conviction that while he might be executed for his crimes, German history would exonerate and lionize him. In 50 or 60 years, there will be statues of Hermann Göring all over Germany, he told Kelly. Little statues maybe, but one in every German home. This author said that he and Kelly's son, Douglas Jr., a major source for the book, used to joke that Kelly meeting Göring was like King Kong meeting Godzilla. After months of interviewing and administering Rorschach, he was using those Rorschach ice ink blot tests. Now, I covered all this when I did the show about how NATO really configured the word psychopaths, right? Using the Dr. Robert Hare and Cleckley. So it's interesting that NATO got involved in diagnosing psychopaths after the war, right? But they seem kind of like they're lost at this point, right? So I'll keep reading. As to Göring specifically, Kelly was astonished that such a clearly intelligent and cultured man so blatantly lacked a moral compass and empathy for others. So Göring and 21 other Nazis went on trial before the International Military Tribunal in November 1945 at the Nuremberg Palace of Justice. About 2 months into the nearly year-long trial, Kelly left Nuremberg and returned to Chattanooga, Tennessee. He said he wanted to get home to his wife, resume his civilian career, and start work on a book based on his experiences. He recalled in it that Göring wept unabashedly when I left Nuremberg for the States. Göring spent hours on the witness stand, offering a spirited, often defiant defense of both his own behavior and Nazism in general. But his wartime record spoke for itself. He was found guilty on all 4 of the charges against him: conspiracy to wage war, crimes against peace, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. On October 1, 1946, the tribunal sentenced him to death by hanging. They rejected his request for a firing squad. So as the story goes, before the scheduled execution, Göring slipped a small glass capsule filled with potassium cyanide into his mouth and crushed it with his teeth, most likely dying within seconds. In a note he left behind, he claimed he'd had the cyanide the entire time he was in prison and managed to conceal it despite repeated searches of his cell. News of Göring's suicide took Kelly by surprise. But in the aftermath, Kelly expressed a controversial admiration for his decision to take matters into his own hands, calling the suicide a skillful, even brilliant finishing touch. The Allies had another finishing touch in mind, reportedly transporting Göring's corpse to the former concentration camp at Dachau for cremation in one of its famous ovens. Well, this really opens up a new story, right? Because those ovens were not working at all. People were not dying in those ovens. So You have to kind of wonder when people say, yeah, I smell the stench from those ovens, or yeah, this person worked in the ovens. You got to wonder, where is the truth in all this, right? So, and they transported Goring out of the area. Well, I don't know. What are the odds that Goring was really dead at the time, right? I would bank that Goring probably wasn't dead at that time. Well, hopefully he's dead now because a lot of years have passed. I would venture to say that, yeah, they slipped him out of there and came up with that story, and he's probably just went on to live a dreadful life, right? So I'll keep reading. This Kelly guy gets even more interesting. Kelly had returned to a busy civilian life at various times, practicing psychiatry, running a psychiatric hospital, teaching, lecturing, and working on his book called 22 Cells in Nuremberg, published in 1947. His public statements often focused on his experiences at Nuremberg and his conclusion that Nazis weren't all that different from other people. Without Hitler, these people are not abnormal, not pervert, not geniuses, he told the Nashville, Tennessee. They're like any aggressive, smart, ambitious, ruthless businessman. Unlike Kelly, Gilbert, who was a psychologist, named I got to introduce Gilbert. Okay. Not everyone agreed with Kelly's diagnosis. Gustav Gilbert, a psychologist who briefly served alongside him at Nuremberg, took a different view. Gilbert had stayed throughout the trials and written a popular book about them called Nuremberg Diary. Unlike Kelly, Gilbert maintained that Nazis were indeed a breed apart. Goring, he concluded, was an aggressive psychopath. Both Kelly and Gilbert have since been faulted for trying to explain the Nazi mind from the small sample size. Kelly transitioned from psychiatry into criminology, becoming a go-to consultant for police departments in California, where his family was now living, and a star witness in headline-making criminal cases. When the director, Nicholas Ray, wanted an expert on juvenile delinquency to review the script for his 1955 film, Rebel Without a Cause, he chose Kelly for the job. Kelly also began appearing on a local TV program called Science and Action. Boy, I don't know about you, but I certainly wouldn't consider seeing Kelly as my doctor. But from all appearances, Kelly had found professional success. But his home life in Berkeley was another story. He drank heavily, fought with his wife, and behaved tyrannically toward his son. On New Year's Day, 1958, apparently after a fight with his wife, Kelly stormed off to his upstairs study, then emerged to announce that he was about to take cyanide and would be dead in 30 seconds. After putting something in his mouth and swallowing, he collapsed like a slackened marionette. Witnessing the event were Kelly's wife, father, and 10-year-old son. Kelly was dead on arrival at Berkeley Hospital. He must have just cracked. I would say so. The irony of Kelly dying the same way as his most famous patient was lost on no one. Some early accounts even suggested he might have snuck the poison home from Nuremberg, although evidence soon emerged that it came from a U.S.-based chemical supply house. Gee, are you thinking about setting up an appointment with a psychiatrist anytime soon? When I was younger, well, a lot younger than I am now, my very first job in the trade show industry, I worked for a company that organized transportation for big conventions. So let's say you were a psychiatrist and you were attending your annual psychiatrist conference in Atlanta, okay? So when you get to Atlanta, you need buses to get you from the hotel to the convention center and wherever the heck you're going to be going while you're staying in Atlanta, right? Well, I worked for this company, and what they did was they were the ones who scheduled all those buses. So I had kind of an unusual opportunity to work with not only the bus drivers themselves, who were very nice, normal people, and the psychiatrist. Well, they assigned me to work the job that came in after the psychiatrist convention. So I was setting up the convention for a group of teachers, okay? And we followed the convention of the psychiatrist. Well, in the city that we traveled to, boy, did these bus drivers have some stories. And they would talk about how all the attendees at the conference seemed like they were insane, and they would describe these psychiatrists, because the psychiatrists would go to the convention center for their meetings, and they'd have to leave the convention center, hop on a bus, and go to the hotel, right? So during this time, all these bus drivers were observing all these psychiatrists, and they were, of course, telling me all their stories, right? Because I was there working with the bus drivers. Yeah, the general feeling from the bus drivers was this. They said, man, those people all appeared crazy. They said, I would never see a psychiatrist if my life depended on it. So that was a view from your average American worker person. Your bus driver saw no need to ever see a psychiatrist just after working at one convention. So yeah, so Kelly had significant personal problems, including heavy drinking, marital conflict, and professional pressure, all of which likely contributed to his suicide. We simply do not know what was going on through his mind in those final moments. So Kelly published 22 cells in Nuremberg, while Gilbert published the Nuremberg Diary. Reading them together is revealing because they often describe the same people but arrive at noticeably different conclusions. One quote from Kelly that has remained controversial because it cuts against the common expectation that monsters must look different from everyone else. He said, they are like any aggressive, smart, ambitious, ruthless businessman. And yeah, I would have to concur with Kelly, because leading the top of the pack in most businesses are likely psychopaths, right? People who have no conscience, no need to give their workers a fair pitch, as long as the money flows to the top. So that is the story of the main psychiatrist that was at Nuremberg. So does this bring questions to your mind? I know it brings a lot of questions in my mind, like, what kind of nut jobs are these people? So anyway, I don't know. I'll be back in a minute, because actually what came out of Nuremberg is what modeled a lot of things. And I find it fascinating that before that time, the word genocide was not even used, right? So I'll be getting back to that when I take a break and come back on the other side. And then, yes, I will eventually get to the story about I'll be getting to the story about who was the mentor to Josef Mengele. And very fascinating story about how he just didn't seem to get any charges. So I'll be back on the other side. Listed down below if you care to take a look at them. A book came out called the German White Book. And then also, Churchill did later make a secret percentages agreement with Stalin. Yeah, Stalin and them, they were all working together. So when you read that, well, Stalin wasn't involved in this, well, that wouldn't necessarily be true. Another piece you might want to take a look at, it was a piece by Joseph Goebbels called Churchill's Lie Factory. Kind of funny, one of them calling the other a liar, right? This article is dated 12 January 1941. Goebbels accuses Churchill of using the big lie technique. Goebbels preferred to tell the truth, or at least the part of it that was useful, to outright lies and propaganda, but was quite capable of doing what he accuses Churchill of doing when necessary. So yeah, he goes on and starts talking about, there's a lot of files. I mean, you can find propaganda all over this place. I found some files that did a highlight on this, and also I did another file because they have all these different groups out there that are now analyzing all this stuff. So I have a lot of that down below that I'm not necessarily going to talk about now, but one interesting thing is the expression the big lie did not originate with Goebbels. Adolf Hitler had already discussed the concept in Mein Kampf in the 1920s, arguing that people are more likely to believe an enormous falsehood than a small one because they themselves would not tell such a big lie. Goebbels later turned the accusation toward Britain's propaganda. Yeah, the big lie theory, right? It is all about the lies, repeating those lies, converting those lies into what they perceive as the truth. Because they all work together, right? So you can work the lies back and forth. You lie about one guy, he can lie about you, then you argue back and forth. Exact same thing that's going on in social media right now. Everybody's talking about, well, that person said this. No, they said that. Try to keep yourself out of the middle of that madness. It is not worth your time or your energy. So anyway, so there's a lot more about that over on my website. I've documented it for you. Let me hold on for a second here. Just as a hint, any of these old books that you want to read, they're pretty easy to find. What you do is you go over to yandex.com and you type in free PDF, and then you list the author and the book's name, and you will come up with a free copy that you can download and read all on your time that you want yourself. I'm really bumbling that one. Anyway, so just go to Yandex, type in free PDF, the author and the book name, and you will find a copy that you can read online. So, genetics. Genetics was part of this whole Nazi thing, okay? And let me put the whole for a second. Okay, what we're going to be talking about is a man named Leo Alexander. He ends up being the guy who introduces all of this stuff to the Nazis. 1905. Leo Alexander is born in Vienna. See, funny how they all end up coming from Vienna, isn't it? He grows up in one of the world's leading medical cities. His father is already an important physician. 1907 to 1914, the idea of eugenics spreads internationally. It is not uniquely German. Research societies appear in Britain, United States, Germany, Scandinavia, and Austria. Many respected scientists support some form of eugenics before Hitler. 1914 to 1918, World War I. Vienna becomes overwhelmed with amputees, shell shock, infectious disease, and malnutrition. Neurology and psychiatry expand rapidly because of wartime injuries. 1918, the Habsburg Empire collapses. Austria becomes a much smaller republic. Despite political collapse, Vienna remains an important scientific center. 1920s, medicine continues advancing. Fields include endocrinology, genetics, psychiatry, and neurology. Many Jewish physicians occupy leading academic positions, or I would say many Roma gypsies are in those positions, right? 1929, Leo Alexander graduates from medical school. Meanwhile, German scientists like Otmar are becoming increasingly influential in genetics. 1933, Hitler comes to power. Hey, Hitler! I wish I could click my heels for you, but I really can't. My feet don't really work like they used to. But I'll pretend like I'm clicking my heels. Oh, Hitler! So Jewish physicians begin losing positions there when Hitler comes into power. And Leo Alexander leaves the German-speaking academic world. 1938, everything changes. Jewish physicians are dismissed, arrested, expelled, forced into exile. Many eventually reach Britain, Canada, Palestine, and the United States. The Vienna medical establishment is permanently transformed. 1939 to 1945, medicine takes two paths. One path, scientists who flee. Examples include Leo Alexander. The other, scientists who remain inside Nazi institutions. They soon become involved in racial hygiene, sterilization, euthanasia, concentration camp research. 1945, the war ends. Ironically, many Viennese or people from Vienna, refugee physicians, including Leo Alexander returned wearing Allied uniforms to investigate crimes committed by physicians who had remained. So, Leo, Vienna was one of the principal places where many of these disciplines matured before they spread across Europe and beyond. When you trace the careers of physicians, psychiatrists, virologists, and genetics from the late 19th and early 20th century, Vienna naturally appears again and again because it was one of the era's most influential centers of medical education and research. You know, the place the Habsburgs came from. Gee, what a shocking supply. What a shocking, why did I say supply? What a shocking turn of events, right? So let's talk about Otto von Verschuer was one of the most influential human geneticists in Germany before and during the Nazi era. Unlike Josef Mengele, he was not stationed in Auschwitz carrying out selections or killings. His importance lay elsewhere. He gave Nazis racial science academic credibility and served as its mentor, whose research interests shaped Mengele's work. Verschuer was born in 1896 and trained as a physician and geneticist after World War I. During the 1920s and early 1930s, he specialized in human heredity, twin studies, medical genetics, inherited diseases, and also Mengele. You read about Mengele in those camps, twin studies, right? Twin research was already being conducted in several countries because identical and fraternal twins offered a way to study the roles of hereditary versus environment. When the Nazis came to power in 1933, however, these legitimate scientific questions became intertwined with Nazi racial ideology. Verschuer, and I'll spell his name because this person was the person who mentored Mengele. It's Verschuer. Verschuer became one of Germany's leading advocates of what Nazis called racial hygiene. His work supported ideas that hereditary traits determined intelligence and character. Some populations were biologically superior to others. Reproduction should be controlled to improve the nation. These ideas helped justify policies such as compulsory sterilization, marriage restrictions, racial classifications, eventually persecution and extermination. Verschuer held senior positions at the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute for Anthropology, Human Heredity, and Eugenics, one of Germany's premier research institutions. So what was his relationship with Josef Mengele? Mengele earned his doctorate under Verschuer. When Mengele joined the SS and was later assigned to Auschwitz in 1943, he remained in contact with his former professor. Letters between them show that Mengele sent research material from Auschwitz back to Verschuer's institute. These materials reportedly included blood samples, eye specimens, organs, pathological reports, data collection from twins. Surviving correspondence indicates Verschuer knew Mengele. He knew that Mengele was conducting research on twins in Auschwitz and welcomed the opportunity to receive specimens for scientific study. Historians continue to examine exactly how much he knew about the methods used to obtain every specimen, but there is broad agreement that the material originated from prisoners in the camp. Twins fascinated Nazi researchers because they hoped twin comparisons would reveal how hereditary traits were passed from one generation to the next. For Mengele, this meant identifying twins on arrival, measuring them repeatedly, drawing blood, conducting painful medical procedures, performing autopsies after death to compare organs. Thousands of twins entered Auschwitz. Only a small fraction survived. Mengele's experiments included repeated blood collection, injections of chemicals and infectious agents, eye color experiments, comparative surgery, dissection after death. Many victims were children. Although Mengele carried out these experiments, the scientific questions often reflected the broader research interests promoted by researchers like Verschuer. And where'd they get the money from? Well, the institute where Verschuer was received funding from organizations including the German Research Foundation and Nazi government agencies who supported research aligned with racial policy. This illustrates that the research was not simply the work of one rogue physician. It was connected to established universities, institutes, and state-sponsored scientific programs. After World War II, unlike many high-profile Nazis, Verschuer was never convicted of war crimes. After the war, he argued he had not known the full extent of Auschwitz crimes. He said his research had been scientific rather than criminal. Denazification authorities ultimately classified him in a way that allowed him to resume his career. In the 1950s, he became a professor at the University of Munster and helped establish one of West Germany's leading human genetics institutes. He remained professionally active until his retirement, and he died in 1969. Today, historians generally distinguish between Mengele and Verschuer while recognizing their close connection. Mengele committed the experiments and atrocities at Auschwitz. Verschuer provided scientific mentorship, institutional support, and a respected academic framework that helped legitimize research rooted in Nazi racial ideology. Their relationship demonstrates how established scientists and universities could become integrated into a regime that used medicine and genetics to justify persecution and mass murder. One of the enduring lessons from this history is that unethical science does not always rise outside mainstream institutions. It can also emerge when respected researchers abandon ethical standards in service of political or ideological goals. So Verschuer was closer to the brains than Mengele. Mengele was a camp doctor with victims in front of him. Verschuer was a senior academic who gave the work a scientific home. So yes, they did work together. Mengele was assigned to Auschwitz to research twins, Roma prisoners, Jewish prisoners, blood samples, bodies, and other research material. And so Mengele sent that back to Verschuer. One scholarly summary says Mengele collected blood and other material from Jewish and Roma families and twins for Verschuer's institute. In 1945, Verschuer reports to the German Research Council that his assistant, Mengele, is working at Auschwitz and that blood samples are being sent to his laboratory. This is the smoking gun type link. Not rumor, but they've actually found a report for him saying they're sending stuff to me. So the war ends in 1945. Mengele escapes. Yeah, funny thing, right? Verschuer avoids major punishment. 1948, the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute structure is gone or reorganized, but Verschuer is not treated like a major war criminal. 1951, Verschuer becomes professor of human genetics at the University of Munster in West Germany and rebuilds his career. He retires in 1965. He dies in 1969. Gee, another brilliant doctor bites the dust. What a shame. What a shame for science that this guy's dead. I just can't even tell you. The tears are just flooding from my eyes as I try to talk. I'm wiping the tears away and I'll continue talking. So the bottom line is this: Mengele was the hands-on butcher at Auschwitz. Verschuer was the credentialed scientific authority behind the project, the mentor, the institute director, the grant-connected researcher, an actual racial hygiene professor who turned prisoners' bodies and blood into science. So Verschuer looks like the brains behind the part of the operation, while Mengele was the field man inside Auschwitz. And this is the interesting part. Verschuer did not disappear like Mengele. Instead, he navigated the denazification process and gradually returned to academic life. Historians generally do not point to a single person who protected him. Rather, they describe a combination of circumstances that worked in his favor. 1945, Germany collapses. Nazi Germany surrenders. Mengele goes into hiding. Verschuer remains in Germany. Unlike SS camp personnel, Verschuer was a university professor. He had not personally served as a concentration camp physician. 1945 to 1946, the Allies had their own priorities. Excuse me. The Allies concentrated first on Nazi political leaders, SS leadership, Gestapo officials, concentration camp commanders, physicians directly involved in human experimentation. The latter, doctors' trials, which went on from 1946 to 1947, prosecuted 23 physicians and officials who could be directly linked to criminal medical experiments. Verschuer was never indicted. One important reason was that prosecutors had much stronger cases against doctors who had personally conducted or ordered experiments. So, 1946, denazification. Like hundreds of thousands of Germans, Verschuer went through denazification. Several factors helped him. He argued he was primarily an academic scientist. He denied directing criminal experiments. Mengele had fled, making investigation of their relationship more difficult. Much wartime documentation had been destroyed or scattered. Scholars had also shown that colleagues submitted favorable statements on his behalf, portraying him as a serious scientist rather than a political extremist. 1947, continuing scientific work. One surprising detail, well, it's not surprising to me and hopefully not to you, is that occupation authorities even allowed him to perform certain civilian genetics work, including paternity testing, while denazification was still underway. This illustrates that local authorities did not treat him as someone barred permanently from scientific practice. So yes, what they claim is this: instead of focusing exclusively on Nazi prosecutions, the Western Allies increasingly emphasized rebuilding West Germany, restoring universities, creating scientific institutions, confronting the Soviet Union. Many professionals with Nazi-era careers returned to medicine, law, engineering, and academia after screening processes of varying strictness. So in 1951, Verschuer becomes a professor of human genetics at the University of Munster. He also helped establish one of West Germany's leading genetics institutions. And that is a remarkable rehabilitation considering his wartime role, if you ask me. So, the 1950s to the 1960s, he built his reputation. He published scientific papers. He trained new geneticists. He participated in professional organizations. He remained respected in parts of the genetics community. His public image became that of a human geneticist rather than a leading racial hygienicist. So why wasn't he prosecuted? Historians generally point to several overlapping reasons rather than a single conspiracy. He was one step removed from the crimes. Unlike Mengele, he was not physically conducting experiments at Auschwitz. The legal evidence was harder to establish. His correspondence showed collaboration with Mengele, including receiving research material from Auschwitz, but proving criminal intent under the legal standards of the time was more difficult than proving direct participation in killings or experiments. There was problems with witnesses and the evidence was incomplete. Many records were destroyed during the final months of the war. Mengele's escape also prevented investigators from questioning the person most closely linked to Verschuer's Auschwitz research. Another very handy thing, right? Get Mengele out of the country. Well, Mengele was over here as Dr. Green clicking those heels, right? So professional networks mattered. Post-war investigations found that respected colleagues wrote testimonials supporting him and emphasizing his scientific credentials. Historians describe this as part of a broader pattern of post-war professional rehabilitation in West Germany. So I couldn't find anybody who directly, specifically helped him, but it looked like everybody pretty much helped him, right? He got high marks from the university crowd. In 1945, as Germany collapsed, Verschuer moved files from the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute for Anthropology, Human Heredity, and Eugenics westward, hoping they would fall into American or British rather than Soviet hands. Some historians believe incriminating material disappeared during this period, although there is no definitive inventory proving exactly what was destroyed. 1946, Verschuer received a surprisingly mild classification. Germany's denazification system had 5 categories. Instead of being classified as a major offender, Verschuer was classified as what's called a Mitfühler, or a follower or fellow traveler, one of the mildest categories, and received only a fine. That classification mattered enormously because it opened the doors to returning to professional life. 1946, not everyone agreed. One interesting detail often omitted is that Robert Haberman, acting within the reorganized Kaiser Wilhelm organization, protested. He argued that Verschuer was not merely a follower, but one of the most dangerous Nazi activists of the Third Reich. His objection did not prevail. 1946 to 47, character witnesses. Verschuer received support from respected academics and associates who portrayed him as a scientist rather than a political ideologue. They portrayed him as someone interested in genetics rather than atrocities, and even someone connected with elements of the Protestant confessing church that had opposed aspects of the Nazi regime. Those testimonials influenced the denazification process. So why would anyone support him? Well, several groups benefited. German universities. After the war, universities had lost professors through death, dismissal, imprisonment, or immigration. Experienced geneticists were in short supply. Universities wanted departments functioning again. Many leading German geneticists had worked with eugenics before or during the Nazi era. If prosecutors declared the entire field criminal, a large portion of German human genetics would have collapsed. Recasting racial hygiene as human genetics allowed the discipline to continue under new terminology. Beginning around 1947 to 1948, rebuilding institutions became a higher priority. Officials increasingly favored integrating professionals instead of permanently excluding them. Because, according to the Western allies, By 1948, the Cold War was underway. American policy shifted from exhaustive denazification toward creating a stable, anti-communist West Germany. That broader political shift benefited thousands of former Nazi Party members, not just the scientists. 1948, lack of prosecutor evidence. At the Nuremberg doctor trials, prosecutors focused primarily on physicians who had directly conducted criminal experiments. Medical investigator Leo Alexander examined Verschuer's case, but concluded there was insufficient evidence to prosecute him successfully, while also considering it likely that incriminating documents had been destroyed. So, only 6 years after the war, in 1951, the year that I was born, only 6 years after the war, Verschuer became professor of human genetics at the University of Munster. He trained a new generation of genetics. Former students also obtained senior university positions across West Germany. Verschuer was not unique. The United States Holocaust Memorial Museum notes that several prominent Nazi-era medical researchers, including Eugen Fischer, Fritz Lenz, and Julius Heidelberg, also resumed scientific careers after the war. So historians generally frame Verschuer's story less as a secret rescue by one powerful patron and more as part of a systematic rehabilitation of many scientists during the early Cold War. One unresolved question that historians continue to debate is how much documentation disappeared before investigations could examine it. Leo Alexander himself believed important records had likely been destroyed, but the surviving evidence does not identify who destroyed them or establish a coordinated effort to shield Verschuer from prosecution. Leo Alexander is a fascinating figure because he sits at the intersection of medicine, intelligence gathering, and the Nuremberg prosecution. He was not the prosecutor and not the judge. He was a chief medical investigator and advisor for the U.S. prosecution in the doctor's trial. So Leo Alexander was born in Vienna. Geez, all roads lead to Vienna, right? In 1929, he receives his medical degree from the University of Vienna. He specialized in neurology, psychiatry, and brain pathology. 1933, Hitler comes to power. Alexander cannot safely continue his career in Germany. He immigrates first through China and then to the United States. Alexander joins the U.S. Army Corps. Rather than serving as a battlefield physician, he becomes involved in neuropsychology and later war crime investigations. As Allied armies enter Germany in the spring of 1945, Alexander is sent to investigate reports of Nazi medical crimes. He interviews witnesses, examines records, and collects documentary evidence. So Alexander becomes one of the principal medical advisors to the American prosecution team. His work helps build what becomes the doctor's trial. So Alexander investigated Nazi medical research generally. He examined evidence relating to concentration camp experiments, euthanasia programs, university medical research, the Kaiser Wilhelm Institutes. He was aware of Verschuer's connection to Mengele. According to later accounts, Alexander believed important evidence linking Verschuer to Auschwitz had likely disappeared before investigators could obtain it. However, he concluded there was not enough admissible evidence at the time to support a prosecution. That is a legal judgment above what could be proved in court, not necessarily a conclusion that Verschuer was uninvolved. So why didn't Alexander push harder against Verschuer? this is one of the historical debates, because Alexander's responsibility was to help build cases that could survive trial. A suspicion, even a strong one, was not enough. He needed witnesses, documents, chain of custody, proof of criminal participation. Without those, prosecutors could not get an acquittal. So the doctor's trial prosecuted only 23 defendants. Isn't that crazy, out of all the ones? By the time investigators reached many institutes, files had been moved, some records had been destroyed, personnel had dispersed, key figures like Mengele had escaped. That made it much harder to prove who knew what and when. So one question historians continue to explore is why the evidentiary threshold was met for some physicians, but not for others, such as Verschuer. That question involves several factors: the destruction or loss of records, the legal strategy of the prosecution, the limited number of defendants selected, and the changing political priorities as the Cold War began. And that was the whole key. They said, hey, we got to hurry this up. We got to worry about this Cold War, right? So, the Cold War really took on a lot of faces, isn't it? And let me see, they had all those doctors' trials. I've got it all documented down below. There's no reason to really flush through every second of it. I think we get the general idea. This Leo Alexander was brought in to take a look at Verschuer. I think he probably did a legitimate look, but the records were gone, so what could the guy do, right? So, the final decisions about indictments rested with the American prosecution leadership after weighing the available evidence and legal standards. I'm not saying that Verschuer was right or wrong. Typically, when records go missing and stuff, I don't think Verschuer had anything to do with any of that, but somehow, mysteriously, Mengele got out of the country, and Verschuer went on to be a pretty well-positioned doctor, right? Guy working at a thing. So, Alexander, he did all that stuff. So, he produced a report about 1,500 pages. He was working under a guy named Telford Taylor, and let me put this on hold for a second. I'm trying to close off this entire file, so let me scan real quick, see if I'm missing anything. From what I could tell, Verschuer knew a lot. He knew that, Alexander knew a lot. He knew that Verschuer directed a major genetics institute. He knew that Mengele had been his assistant. He knew that specimens had been shipped from Auschwitz to Verschuer's laboratory. Alexander believed there were grounds for serious suspicion, but the surviving record indicates he concluded that there was insufficient evidence available at the time to sustain a criminal prosecution. He also thought important documents had probably disappeared before investigators reached them. So, Alexander published a book called Medical Science Under Dictatorship, and I think we got the picture here, right? I think we got the picture. The people that were in charge that did the most harm, they didn't get any kind of charges, right? So I think that explains it all, and it's still going on today, right this second. I'd like to close with a few thoughts here. I thought this was a really funny quote. It said, let me see, I can't see very well. It says, you see those signs outside that say, warning dog, warning there's a dog on premises. This one said, warning, dog has a gun, and I think he's off his medication. I hope that you're getting your property secure. Cameras that do not run on the internet. Weapons if you choose. Get those bars on those windows. You don't want to put bars on the outside of your windows, and put them on the inside of your windows where nobody will notice. The Nuremberg trials ended in 1949. The questions they raised about war, justice, evidence, and accountability have never truly disappeared. I would like to say in the closing that it's important that everybody get that head on a swivel There's all kinds of people flooding the market. There's all kinds of robberies going on. Get your sleep. Eat well. Drink plenty of fluids. You know all of the answers. You came with all of the answers. But when we came here, we forgot that memory was taken from us. So when we entered the game board, our memory of our past life is not there for us to access right away. We have to know how to access that. You need to consider blocking your energy. And when you get plenty of rest, you need to access yourself. You have all of the answers. We had a review of all of this before we even came here. We know why we're here. Do you know why you're here? Have you recovered why you're here? And what are you going to do to stay on the game board? The main thing is to think for yourself. Get the fog of what everybody's saying out of your ears. We know what the truth is. So there's no reason to hear people badger back and forth over Iran or this or that, all the constant arguing. Try to clear some of that from your head. Embrace silence in your own body. Make sure you're taking care of yourself. You have the answers. Just know that. Goodbye for now and be safe out there. Everybody knows what's going on. It's just nobody is talking. You think these people don't know what's going on? Yeah, a bunch of them do likely know what's going on. A lot of the people you see on the screen are lawyers themselves. Do they know that U.S. lost the war and all that? Well, a lot of them are really not all that smart, are they? They're really parrots sitting there talking the party lines. They're there to argue amongst themselves and to distract you and keep your time tied up with their nonsense. Remember, this is the last battle between good and evil. Use your time and your senses and very wisely because they know what's going on. It's about time we paid attention to what's going on. Be safe out there. Goodbye for now.